So welcome to this new stage event where we have, as always, great guests. We have dshadoff and GreyRogue. They both have a lot of work under the belts and also a lot of experience. And it's interesting that they both have been working towards achieving better precision and documentation around the platforms that they love and which they have contributed to. So, can you please introduce yourselves tonight? We have a lot of stuff to cover, and it'll be my pleasure to be talking to you. Eric, you are also known as GreyRogue. Could you please introduce yourself to the audience?
So I go by GreyRogue. It's a combination of two of my favorite things, which you can tell by my picture there. It's Grey is reference to Grey Wanderer, and Rogue is the Rogue Squadron from a little before the Rogue One movie. The Rogue Squadron. But anyway, combination of Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. So
nice. And we also have, as I mentioned, dshadoff. Dave, could you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Hi. Well, I'm Dave, and I'm a little bit addicted to the PC Engine,
which is really good. There's nothing wrong with that. The PC Engine is an awesome platform. So we're gonna get started as always by getting to know you a little bit better, and I'm gonna ask you, Dave, what got you into games?
Games? You mean games in general?
Well, it could be games in general or video games, whichever you feel fits better, because they are not disconnected.
Yeah, well, I think my first video game was probably, those TV Pong systems. I'm a little bit older than probably most of the audience, but I think really what got me into trying to create something of any sort was, one day I walked into a Radio Shack and I saw, one of these programs and BASIC, little cannon on top of a hill shooting a cannonball, and I thought that's really cool. And I'd already been into electronics a bit at that point, which was an extremely expensive hobby back then for a kid, at least. So I kind of switched over to programming computers in the late 70s, and from there, the whole market evolved and switched over the 80s, and I'm sure we'll get a little bit more into that, but that's my starting point.
Nice. And what about you, Eric? What got you into video games or computers?
It's funny. I was just thinking about the past couple days that I had a similar thing. It was a Pong. It was called a TV scoreboard, which was just another version of those Pong one-on-a-chip thingies. Mm-hmm. Although I will say that the one that we had a very satisfying set of buttons. I think they're like the equivalent of like the IBM M keyboard, whatever, that has a satisfying click. I love the buttons on that old TV scoreboard thing that we had. But after that, when the TI Texas Instrument 99 4A started to have problems and basically clearanced them, my dad got one of those and a whole slew of games for them. So I have a particular soft spot for Parsec and Munchman and TI Invaders and all the clones of all the popular arcade games they made on there. But also at the same time, I really enjoyed a lot of the educational titles that they had on that too, which, I'm convinced that things like the math games that they had on there were super important just for flashing, the equivalent of flashcards, just repeated using of memorizing those basic math things helps you later on. So I started with that.
Yeah, those games are really interesting because we don't see such kind of thing as much in mainstream platforms as we did back then, right?
Yeah, I give a particular shout out to Number Munchers. I think that's as relevant today as when I played it. I think it's a super fun game, and I think it's super helpful.
The main title that I recall from that kind of genre in my infancy was Math Fun for the Intellivision, but it's way simpler. So we all saw this industry growing during the 80s, which are your fondest memories of games back to that era, Eric?
Fondest memories of that era?
Yeah.
Well, the one that jumps to mind is maybe a little bit further down the line when we had a PC, and we had gotten, my brother had bought the original X-Wing on, I don't know how many floppy disks that thing came on, but it was a bunch. And so I remember my brother bought it and was afraid that my dad would get mad because he'd spent that much money on the game. So we installed it without telling him. And then my dad the next day thought he had a virus because he was missing 20 megabytes of his 200 megabyte hard drive. So that's kind of a fun memory. And then kind of related to that, at some point I started digging through the files in the game, and just by randomly experimenting, replacing numbers in the mission files, I figured out how to swap the TIE fighters for Star Destroyers, and that made the game a little more interesting.
Did you break it along the way?
It's funny, if like on some of those early missions, if you put 3 Star Destroyers in the same location as 3 TIE fighters, they're too close to each other, so they're trying to avoid hitting each other the whole time, and so you can shoot them without getting shot. So actually made it easier.
Nice. And what about you, Dave? Which kind of memories do you have from that era?
Well, probably the fondest memories I've got is kind of 2 of them, right? I mean, before I actually managed to purchase a computer, because they were very expensive back then, I remember taking the bus and going downtown to Toronto, because I live in that area. And along the way, I would go to the Radio Shack store to see what did they have, and was there any other people coming in that particular Saturday to talk about what was going on and so on. But along the way, there were a number of arcades, and you just can't help it but just walk into one of those, and all the new games that were always coming out, things like Pac-Man and Galaxian, Galaga, Targ, Spectar, all of these were they were like magic. And of course, at that moment, there weren't really any computers that had color.
Mm-hmm.
But everybody wanted to see. Yeah, I want to have that game, but not have to spend $20. I want to write that on my machine at home, and actually there were some really good games by a company called Big 5 Software out of Van Nuys, California, for the Model 1. Those were really good, and I guess probably the second fond memory, kind of parallel, was there were a couple of really good games on the Radio Shack Color computer, which is my second computer, about 2 years later. And I think I remember one of my favorite games was what was it called? Time Bandit. And cracking the protection on the Zaxxon cassette the day that it came.
And were you successful?
Yeah.
Nice.
Took me a couple of hours longer than I thought it would, though.
And now that you mentioned that, you are for a slightly different age bracket than many of us, but I always wonder, to your same age peers, is it even rarer for them to be into games and computers than for us? Because that's the generation I have little touch with.
Yeah, I think there were people my age and older who went to the arcades, but they didn't really take to it so much on home computers and so on. I recall, I got into computers as an occupation,
Mm-hmm.
and I was, for the first 10 years of my career, the youngest guy in the office, which is kind of weird, right? Because you think it's always constantly younger and younger people, but there was a time in the 80s when it was just a bunch of aging, middle-aged people, and PCs hadn't really penetrated yet.
That's really interesting, because I think that if you grew up with this stuff, it would impact you more in that era than it impacted me or somebody that was like 5 or 10 years younger, because you saw those changes progressively and could understand them if you went into them, right? but that didn't happen.
You mean in my case, or you mean in the case
general.
of people older than me?
Yeah, in general.
I mean, maybe I'm part of the generation, or I can't really call it a generation, a group of people who really felt that, yeah, it was possible to know everything about a machine forever, right? Until some point in the 90s when the complexity exploded.
Yeah, and we'll go deeper into that theme because it's really central and important to both you guys' work. What do you think about this, Eric? What do you think about how it felt growing up and seeing all these technologies and the people, how much they went into them around you?
I think I was always a little more interested than people my own age, but I think by the time that I was growing up, it had already started. It's interesting because I was thinking about in second grade, where they'd send us to, during school hours, they'd say once a week there or twice a week, they'd send you to computer lab, and they'd have things in there like number munchers or whatever, but they'd also have things in there that were just straight up games. And I guess that was an attempt to get maybe some of the kids who weren't as inclined to mess around with the computer to at least interface with one. And I think that's probably, I have to doubt that still happens these days, that any schools out there think that they need to have a class to get kids interested in trying to use a tablet or something, but I don't know, it's just kind of weird. But yeah, like they'd have the number munchers, and they'd have Oregon Trail, which was really just a buffalo shooting game when I was a kid, or the one that I would play a lot was called Swashbuckler, and it was just a straight up sword fighting game. Well, there wasn't really too much educational about it, so interesting.
Now that you mention it, it came to my mind because when you bought a computer back in those days, it came with, first of all, physical manuals, but those manuals could be in two parts, two separate manuals, or the part of the manual at the back taught you how to program that computer and maybe even how to repair it and had diagrams. Did you have contact with that, and what do you think about that in contrast to today's world? Eric?
Well, certainly when we got that TI-99, it had a manual with a bunch of example programs in there, and I absolutely typed those into the computer, and I'd modify numbers here and there to see what it would do, and that kind of started programming for me. Was doing stuff like that. I mean, and it helps that I was, again, young. I was 6 or 7, typing in these programs and modifying them, and just it led to greater appreciation for programming and wanting to do it more.
Yeah, and what about you, Dave?
You mean having contact with systems that came with their own documentation?
Yeah, and the contrast to today's world.
Yeah, well, back in the first generation, the Model 1 and so on, there were a lot of, like, the magazines would have, here's a customization you can do to your machine. Here, here's how you can put lowercase on your screen. Or let's open it up. Let's make an electronics add-on that plays music out the back. These were like hobbyist projects, and I had built a couple of those. There was sort of the, I mean, you don't, at that point, you spend all of your money for a year on buying a machine, and you're really afraid to connect something up to it that isn't really certified, right? But did that, and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I can imagine. Was it easy to source the parts and the tools to work on this?
It was a completely different world back then. I mean, if I couldn't get it at Radio Shack, and I mean they would have like resistors but they wouldn't have most of the chips, right? So you'd have to go to like Active Electronics, and those guys, they'd say, yeah, well, if you're not a business, we don't really want to give you an account. And why would I give an account to a kid? Well, I don't want credit, man. I just want to buy some parts. But yeah, it was difficult. And of course, PC boards, you couldn't just order them. You would take these black tapes and stick them to the to a printed circuit board, and you try to etch it in this ferric chloride solution in a shallow tub somewhere, and of course, noxious chemicals, and how do I get rid of this junk? Is it okay to put in the sewer, and so on like that.
And what about you, Rick? Were you into that kind of modifications, and how difficult was it for you?
Well, when I was a little older into high school, I had kind of an amazing teacher. He was the physics teacher, and then he also had a computer science and engineering class that he taught, which I don't know how common that was at the time, but it was super neat. Some of the things that we did in there include like taking out breadboards, and you'd wire up little logic games where you could there'd be chips that can, using NAND gates and AND gates and OR gates and whatever, you'd do a little lockout game where it would randomly light up an LED, and then each person would try and hit their buzzer first, and whoever got it first, it would lock out the other one, so you could tell who was faster. So I did stuff like that, and then also later on, he had us. I don't know how common wire wrapping is known. It's not super common, I don't think now, and I don't know that it was then very much. But we would wire wrap together just a simple 6502 with some memory and like a TTL terminal, and so basically made a little computer with wire wrapping, which is kind of a simple way of soldering, probably safer too. The school probably preferred that we not use soldering irons as much.
Yeah, and it's also it also tends to be neat because you have to tense the wires, right?
So as I recall, it's been a long time since I did this now. You strip a large portion of it, and then you just wrap it around the leg like a dozen times or something to make a.
You use a tool, right?
Yeah, there's a specific tool that you'd slide the wire into it, and then push the whole thing over the leg of the chip, which was long, and then you just spin it, and it would wrap the wire around it multiple times.
Yeah, I've always wanted one of those tools. And did you have experience like that, Dave? I mean, building with wire wrap, or you went straight to solder?
I was soldering at age 7.
Wow.
And I probably still have some scars. But no, I never actually tried wire wrap. It always looked really complex.
Yeah,
that's funny. I think I always thought that soldering was harder, so I largely avoided it.
Regarding soldering, I guess that you at that time that you blindly look for the soldering iron and grab it with your full hand. You never forget that.
Yeah, no, I don't think I did that, but I did brush the back of my opposite hand a few times.
Wow, yeah. That also happens. So, did you ever get into like mainstream gaming systems back in the 80s? Like, I don't know, the PCS, the Intellivision, the NES. What about you, Eric?
So after the TI-99, I believe that the next one and stop after that for me was the NES, and so I also have a pretty good soft spot for that. I've got a lot of memories of playing games that I'm sure a lot of people who enjoy the NES would recognize and do recognize and are pretty well known. But I like some of the ones, I guess, they're a little less popular too. Like I still think Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is a great game. I beat that one as a kid and loved it. But I tended to like some of the harder ones too. I don't know if I ever managed to completely beat Ninja Gaiden. I know I made it to the final boss rush as a kid.
Mm-hmm. That's brutal. Yeah.
But then some of the ones that, and then like so maybe some of the lesser known, but still probably people know about, like Super Dodgeball has always been a favorite of my family's. Or one that I personally liked was F1 Built to Win, which was a racing game that started you out in I think a Mini Cooper, which I didn't know what it was as a kid. Not familiar with British cars, but it starts you out in a Mini Cooper with terrible tires and terrible engine, and as you race, you make money, and you can make your car better, and then eventually buy a new car, and it sends you all over the United States through different races, and then eventually you make it to the F1 circuit, and you start over. I had a ton of fun playing that game as a kid.
And what about you, Dave?
Yeah, so for consoles, I mean, I remember having a couple of friends who had like an Intellivision, a ColecoVision, and I really wanted one, but they were just too expensive at the time. But I had my computer, so that was fine. And then, you know, I wrote a game for the color computer in 83, 84. And just as that got released, we had the whole Atari collapse, the 1984 collapse of the whole video game, everything. And I mean, that was just as I was going off to university as well. So I kind of walked away from the scene for a while. I kind of missed out on the NES, and I mean, I wouldn't have been too impressed at it at the time anyway, because it just, you know, the colors and the sprite sizes weren't the kinds of things, even though the games are good, those things weren't really enough to turn my crank. But a few years later, I was traveling in Hong Kong, and I'm walking through this underground arcade, and I see off to my side this system, and it looks kind of like an arcade system, but it's just a TV set. And I walk over to it, and it was playing. It was a PC Engine playing something. I don't remember exactly what. Might have been Kung Fu, or it might have been Ys. But just the colors and the sound and the size of the sprites, it shocked me, and I wanted to get more. So that's sort of how it gelled on the PC Engine.
And did you end up buying a PC Engine on that trip, or?
I
later?
did.
Okay.
I did. And then later on, when I thought this thing's going to have to come out in North America. It's got to come out in North America as well. And around that time, Toronto was getting a lot of immigrants from Hong Kong, and some of them set up these video game import shops. So you had them importing a couple of PC Engine games. And so I bought a couple of games. And when later that year, when TurboGrafx came out, I bought one, and I was all excited, and I thought it was going to be a big thing. Little did I know. But around Christmas time, I broke open both of the systems, and I started tracing out all the wires, and I realized that these are really the same system with just a few data lines swapped. So I built a little converter, and it worked. And then I got my brother to help me sketch out a PC board, and I would talk to one of the guys who owned one of these toy stores that did the imports, and he still had contacts back in Hong Kong to get parts, and we made the Kisado connector, which was
legendary
kind of
Kisado.
Yeah, kind of a big deal in the PC Engine scene for a while.
Awesome. That's awesome. And then my next question was precisely related to what you were just telling us. What did you feel that some of the CPUs that you knew from personal computers or from maybe the university were being used in these machines? Because maybe some of the public doesn't know this, but the PC Engine and the NES do have the same CPU, basically, right?
Yeah. Well, I wasn't so into the 6502 yet. I had a buddy who had a VIC-20 and a Commodore 64 and a Commodore PET, and he was really gung-ho on the 6502. I had another friend who had an Apple II, and he was big on the 6502, but I learned on the Z80, and I moved on to the 6809, which, sad to say, is a far superior processor to the 6502. But, you know, and then I went off to university, and yeah, they were teaching a course on 6809, and my prof was really a disappointment.
Okay. And what about you, Rick? When did you, because we're a different age bracket here, when did you start getting into those kind of details regarding the game consoles?
Game console specifically.
Or computers, doesn't matter.
Well, I'm just thinking I did start a little bit in that high school class I mentioned. We learned some assembly on, I think it was the Z80. Z80, I guess. So I had started to learn some assembly there, whereas most of the stuff that I'd done before then was like BASIC or some of the higher level programs. But the first like game related, looking at how it works type stuff was probably when I was in high school. There was an arcade game that I really liked called Outrun.
Oh.
which not, or no wait, not Outrun. Sorry, that's the one I always mix those two up. Outrun is the one that everybody knows. Hot Rod.
Okay.
Hot Rod is an overhead racer by Sega. It is by Sega, but it's an overhead racer. And they had this in the arcade, and all of my friends loved it. And I had noticed that maybe a few years later than that, it had shown up in MAME as unsupported. And so my first kind of dig into how the game actually works on the code was to start digging through there. And it turns out that the only reason it was unsupported was one tiny little bug, and I figured it out. So that was my... if you go back looking in MAME, you can see... I think I mentioned in the pull request or whatever they called it back then, but that got System 24 games to work on MAME. And it turns out that the change is really small. It was just an issue of address mapping. So the processor that it was used in the systems had it's a 32-bit processor, so it had more lines of addressing for memory than it can use.
Mm-hmm.
And so somewhere in the code, it addressed stuff beyond where the memory was at. And so in MAME at the time, it didn't know what to do with that, so it ignored it. And it turned out that what you really had to do was just ignore some of the high bits. And then all of a sudden, the whole system started working.
Awesome. Because this is something that's fairly common, that people that don't have access to the hardware can fix things in emulation, right? And it feels strange from the outside, but it is more common than you expect, right?
Yeah, it did come from having a knowledge in general of how processors work, and just recognizing that likely, like you could see that they were there was a debug message in MAME saying, "Oh, by the way, it's reading and writing to this area of memory where there's nothing there," and that would show up in the log. And then so all you really had to do was to say, "Well, why are they doing that?" And it's just, "Oh, they're just ignoring the extra bits." And yep. So if you recognize how it probably was wired up, you might not necessarily need to know for sure that happens, especially if you try it and it works. Yeah. Although that is a dangerous method.
But it's fairly common when you're working with software, right?
Yep.
And well, what happened with that little PC Engine after that, Dave?
Well, actually, after about a year or so, the PC Engine was going, and I got a Mega Drive, but I didn't really play any games on it. But when the Super Nintendo came out, and that seemed to steal everybody's attention, I kind of disappeared from the scene for a bit. And I was invited back to the Turbo list in '93, and met a bunch of people online, and learned about importing more of the newer games from Japan. And I thought, oh, that's really cool stuff. And so I got into it there. Everybody was really excited about the Casado that I had. And that really grew. And I thought, you know what, it would be really cool if we could make our own game. But, there was no technical information. Right? And it was a struggle. How do you write a game for something that there's no technical information for? Well, you got to try and take it apart and see what's in there. And well, there's supposed to be a 6502 of some sort, but it's the memories are much bigger and they seem to be uniform and so on. So you're digging, you're trying to find information, you're asking people, and at some point, we got a few whispers from some guy who had been a developer or been related to development in Japan, and he gave us some very basic information, but it was enough to start decoding the existing programs, and or at least to a certain degree. And at that point, I thought, well, you know what? Maybe I should try to make an emulator. And this is before Magic Engine, and there were just whispers of NES emulators going around as well. And so I started to write one, and it got to the point where it would run a few seconds of a few games, just as Magic Engine was coming out. But mine had a debug interface. And when Magic Engine came out, obviously it was a much better emulator, and David Michel was absolutely up for sharing whatever technical information he had, and that went really well. And we spent a few weekends trying to figure out how the arcade card worked, and that was a lot of fun too. Somewhere around '96, they published some more information about the PC Engine, but it was in a book called Debero. It was a Japanese kind of they called it a MOOC. It's a magazine and a book kind of a format with a CD-ROM on it. And they were trying to get people to become developers. It didn't do so well, but it was a first glimpse at some developer information, and we got a few more extra bits and pieces off of that. Very difficult to decode, though, except if you could read katakana, you could probably read about 20% of the words in the book, which was the way that a lot of magazines are, a lot of technical manuals. Katakana are mostly words originating in English, but transliterated, although sometimes they're really brutalized.
Phonetical, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of fun. Yeah. And since then I've been trying to figure out little bits and pieces of the PC Engine. Not everything is known even today.
That's true. And just as a note for everybody that's listening that probably doesn't know what the PC Engine is and the TurboGrafx, they're small systems that came out to compete directly with the NES back in the mid-'80s. And they were fairly superior in terms of color, speed, and sound, because you could code in wavelets, right? That kind of thing. It's a PSG, but you could upload small, you'd say it's samples, but not exactly, and loop those. And it was above what an NES could do in terms of color and resolution. And it was expanded. You mentioned the arcade card, and the arcade card is a device that allows the CD-ROM add-on to have extra RAM so it can buffer stuff from the CD-ROM, right? It's like you used to have a spoon to take out water from a pool, and now you had a huge plate, and it was easier to take out chunks of data from the CD-ROM to the system. And speaking about that and the arcade work that you did, Eric, many things are unknown in the PC Engine to this date, and that's, I know, not the mainstream system around the world, but it's a big system that was AAA and had many games. It almost beat Nintendo in Japan for a while, and was competing with the Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo for quite a while. It took several years that it was fighting, and that is not very well documented. Now, you were working in those early days with MAME on an arcade PCB, and arcade PCBs are even less so documented, right? Did you work more in that path?
As far as MAME went, I think I tried a little bit to help with some of the encryption stuff that was happening, but I really wasn't probably much help. Like that was the time that they were looking at the what do they call those? The
GPS.
No, it's the 68K.
Oh, the Sega ones.
Encrypted processors. I think they had Z81s that were encrypted, and they also had 68K that were encrypted. I forget what the model names are, but
the FD CPUs, right?
FD, that sounds right.
1094, I believe, is one.
Those are the ones.
Yes.
So I remember at the time that I was looking at MAME, that those were kind of coming up, and so I was a bit of a math nerd, so I was just trying to look for patterns in the encryption tables that they were generating, look for simplifications. I don't think I did very much with that, but I did try for a while. It was fun, just as a logic type of thing to do. I've always liked logic puzzles, like those. I don't know if you've ever seen the kind of puzzles where they say like Jane is sitting 2 seats from the left, and Fred is sitting 3 seats from somebody who doesn't like purple or something, and they'd give you the list of things, and you go through and try and solve them. I guess it's kind of like Picross as a game, but logic puzzles like that have always appealed to me, and trying to look through encryption tables, I guess, is kind of a ridiculous upgraded version of that.
Yeah, because it's huge chunks of data that, and that's one thing that I wanted to ask about the tools that you were using. You didn't have like entropy visualizers in 3D, right?
No, I was just
yeah.
You just kind of pull up in like a hex editor or something and just kind of skim through it and look for anything that looked like it was repeating, or maybe you could do it so it would alternate a certain number of times, and just looking for patterns was all I was doing, which is why I probably didn't accomplish much.
Yeah, it's completely different, the tools and the CPUs that you had access to, and the same goes for Dave, right? What kind of equipment were you using to build these emulators, and also to try and figure out and picking at the PC Engine innards?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, oscilloscopes back then were well over $1,000, and logic state analyzers wouldn't give you what you needed, and also they were super expensive. I started out with a like one of those copier systems from Hong Kong.
Wow.
I picked it up in '92 and did a dump on the machine, and I started just understanding what does the byte code look like. If this was a 6502, what would I be decoding? Where would I be going? What would be in register A, X, or Y at this moment? And so based on that, I built a rudimentary emulator for the CPU first, and single step through instructions. And
how easy was it to get information on each CPU? I know there are books, but how easy was it for you to get that information?
Well, 6502 was really well documented. So, I mean, if I start from the assumption that this is a 6502 with some extensions, I only have to worry about the extensions. So those would show up as undocumented instructions. That's easy enough. It wasn't just me. There were other people also poking around trying to find, who's developing on this system. There's some American developers somewhere. Where are they? There's some Japanese people, but by that time they still weren't on the internet. Japan was about 5 to 10 years later, because computers were not a home thing. By and large, they were more of a, you go to work and there's a computer at your desk, and why would you want one at home kind of a thing. So it was really separated worlds. But we could get little bits and pieces. We could say, oh, it's trying to write to this address here. I wonder what's supposed to be at that address. And especially in '96 when that book came out, Debero, that really opened some doors in terms of, here's how the graphics are encoded. Here's what the palette is like, and here's some information on the sound system. It wasn't enough, but it was certainly a big jump forward. And then it's really, a little bit of intuition, a little bit of log tracing, a little bit of so on and so forth. And you say, well, I got to write a test. Are there any wait states? Okay, so you find out, yes, there are wait states. But of course, that doesn't tell you the whole story. When you're writing to the video RAM, you know that there were wait states. You don't know when those wait states are. And that's a big thing. I can tell you that no PC Engine emulator is as good as the MiSTer core for PC Engine since SRG 320 rewrote it, because he understood the wait states on the video RAM. He must have done huge logic traces. It's brilliant work. But you can take a look at Wonder Momo. That game, it goes through a sequence where it loads a bunch of stuff into video memory, and it runs 2 IRQs on the same IRQ line. One IRQ is going to be at the end of the screen, and the other one is at a line about a third of the way down from the end of the screen.
Mm-hmm.
And the program isn't smart about it. It doesn't say, "Oh, which one of them is this particular interrupt?" It just says, "Okay, on interrupt A, I do this. On interrupt B, I do that." And if you load the video RAM too quickly, it'll get mixed up as to which one is A and which one is B. And that's why, emulators like MedNAFN show it up with a kind of a disjoint title screen.
I see, and that's something hard to come by unless you have these tools, right? You mentioned that he probably had huge logic analyzer dumps to figure that out.
Yeah, I can't see how he would have been able to otherwise. I mean, a lot of people in the scene have written tools in software to say, "Let me see if I can trick the processor into doing this." I mean, two of the guys, Chris Covell and a gentleman who calls himself Elmer on the boards. Both of those guys know very well what the timing number of cycles are between this interrupt and that interrupt, and when the latch happens on a scan line, because they wrote those tests. They were measuring how many CPU cycles would happen. But that you can count cycles, but you don't know if there's 3 out of 5 cycles that have a wait state. You don't know which 3 they are.
Yeah, and that's something that's central to what we'll both talk, and that you probably have a lot of experience also as well, Eric, that we don't have these game consoles figured out yet, right? Fully, I mean. Things are advancing and we are learning stuff, but it's hard to believe for somebody out there about the nuance of getting this information right, and not only getting it documented and demonstrated in some way, but also to get it implemented in your system, right? Because it's the PC Engine, for example, it's how many years old?
30. It's going to be 35 next year.
Yeah, it's going to be 35, and we are just now getting to a point where the technology to do the analysis for a hobbyist is kind of at hand, right? And group efforts around the world, and we are getting older, and systems are getting older. So there's so much work that needs to be done. And what has been your relationship to this kind of information, Eric?
Well, it's kind of funny that he mentioned Wonder Momo. I at one point did try to fix that in the MiSTer core for PC Engine, and came to the exact same conclusion, just like he was talking about, how it could be one or the other, and it would have been really easy for those software devs to just put in a tiny little piece of code that would automatically choose one or the other, and then the emulators wouldn't have to worry about it. But no, they didn't. And yeah, I tried to work at it, and because I didn't have the those wait states like he's talking about, it was just I couldn't fix it because I just didn't have the knowledge of how to do it. I didn't have the hardware to go probing into a real one to see how it works. And yeah, that Wonder Momo is sometimes you just want to walk up to the devs and shake your head at them, but they got it working on the hardware, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah,
there are so many stories of emulator authors finding code in games that does not make sense or takes advantage. It relies on a bug behavior, and probably the dev never knew about it.
Yep.
Yeah, the public needs to understand here that thing is that hardware is canonical, not the specification, not the documentation. They could be at conflict, because a bug at that level obviously wasn't documented at the time. So even if the documentation says something, if hardware does a different thing, that's canon. And if we have several versions of a console or a personal computer, and each one behaves differently with that, that's a big issue, right?
Yeah. So I can think of another example of something like this. I think it's King of Fighters 2004. I think on the Neo Geo that has a
hack.
Yeah. So King of Fighters 2004 is actually kind of a homebrew, really.
Mm-hmm.
I think it pulls in code from all sorts of places wherever it can find them to try and generate a huge roster. And one of the things that people did is they pulled in sound samples from other games that weren't originally on the Neo Geo. And so if you go and at one point somebody had reported a bug in the Neo Geo core with I think it's Athena, where the sound completely corrupts while it plays. And so I went digging on that for a little while and eventually found out that I had to do some guesswork again, which is kind of what I do. And I had noticed that there was a change in, I guess it was in MAME, where they had updated their code recently to get an updated view of how the Neo Geo samples are encoded. And so I went and started thinking a little bit and said, okay, this was only recently known. So back when this Homebrew 2004 game was created, they're using the wrong method to encode samples. And so I went and dug around for a while and eventually found where the sample was in the game, pulled out the binary data, did the opposite of the broken wrong encode thing, so to decode it back into the raw waveform. If you play that raw waveform, sure enough, the corruption is gone. It doesn't have the weird noise and screeching that happens on there as a raw waveform. And then if you go and then apply the correct, newly figured out encoding method on that waveform, you can put it back into a binary sample that the Neo Geo recognizes. And if you paste that over the top of the original one, you now have sound that doesn't mess up on real hardware. So
yeah, and it's kind of the inverse situation, right? Because it's the same kind of problem, documentation and tools not being available, but they simply did it wrong back then, and you could correct the game, right?
Yep.
Was that game an authentic release, or was that
no? So it's so I think they took one of the previous versions of King of Fighters as a base, and then they just added like characters from like the PlayStation version and whatever. But
so this would play on an emulator, but not on real hardware.
Yeah. So if you played it on MAME, then at the time it sounded correctly because MAME was using the same incorrect encoding decoding scheme. But if you tried to play it on real hardware, you'd get screeching, nasty noises because it was wrong.
Pet peeve.
It's kind of the equivalent of the NES homebrew from way back when, where people would make modifications, ROM hacks or whatever, that relied on incorrect understanding of how the NES mappers work. So.
Exactly, and then people would be, the competing emulator would be called out on it being, wrong.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the question becomes, is it wrong? Let's try it on real hardware. And then, oops, doesn't work on real hardware.
And testing on real hardware wasn't as easy back then when many of these things were done, right? Like game translations. I worked a bit on a Super Nintendo fan translation for Sailor Moon Another Story, and the ending patch did run on emulators, but didn't run on real hardware. That happens a lot.
It does, and it's very hard to test thoroughly on real hardware, but there were ways of doing that. I mean, unless somebody invented a new mapper, in which case it would never run on real hardware unless you built it, cartridge.
Yeah, that's a very important question, and something that fortunately has become less of a conflict point as years passed, and people have ways to run flashcards and or send data directly to the console, right? But back then, as you mentioned, the emulator that did it wrong got the upper hand because it ran, right?
Oh, I see it. I see it kind of the reverse. I think that we're going to see more and more of it as the hardware disappears.
Oh, yeah, probably.
Well,
yeah.
In a way, I think I agree with what Artemio was saying there, though, is at the time, the emulator that could run it would seem like the better one. It's just, now in retrospect, people that have those old ROM hacks that don't work, nowadays, those are terrible ROM hacks. Don't play those. Those don't work. So
Or somebody fixed
kind of
them.
flipped.
Yeah,
it was
maybe
at the time, but they're not now.
The quality of ROM hack is improving, I suppose. But I see Trinks is writing every NES bug report ever. It's every Magic Engine bug report ever as well. Is how did you rip this? Where did you get this from? Is this authentic? Does it work? Because basically every bug report ever.
Yeah, and fortunately, we have better ways nowadays to test that. And yeah, confirmation is hard. And both of you have probably been a lot into that kind of confirmation in the end, because it ends up in your lab and not the person requesting the bug to be fixed.
Oh yeah, for sure. I worry about the authenticity of rips because how bad they were in the early days. It's gotten a lot better, but when somebody gets something off of the internet, you really never know. So I have to test the real game on real hardware.
Yeah, and just as it's been mentioned by Trinix and Santiago on the chat, and by you guys, mainly what you just mentioned, Dave, that as original hardware fades out, this can go anywhere, right? Unless we have proper implementations or proper documentation, because documentation could survive implementations if implementations are not kept up with technology. Documentation also needs to do that, but it's kind of easier. And it's hard because we know that we'll never get to the point that we'll be 100% sure that everything is documented. Or do you think we will?
As machines get more complex, it's exponentially more difficult. I think on a game system like PC Engine, we can convince ourselves of 99.999%. There'll always be this one little question mark, but you know, as an emulator author from way back, I say, yeah, it's the CPU and the VDP and all the little bits on the circuit board. But as you know, beyond that, it's not just that. It's how does it communicate with the peripherals? What's the timing like to external things? How is the color? How is the sound? And so on and so forth.
And the analog parts of the machine, right?
Absolutely.
And have you?
I mean, it's
sure.
only in the last few years, I think, that anybody's actually been looking at those parts.
Yeah, that's true. And getting back to what we were saying, it's because we have access to technology, and it's strange, right? Because sometimes you can say, just put that old Sega Master System into a sealed bin and let it be kept for, I don't know, 50 years. And when we get more technology, analyze it. But is that feasible? I believe that we need to do as much as we can right now.
Your capacitors are going to rot the traces underneath them.
Yeah. You'd need somebody to know exactly what they're doing and mummify the system, right?
I think so.
And Eric, have you dealt with any issues in certain games or cores that are related to these kind of things, like small quirks that are not documented in the hardware aside from those?
Yeah, there's that's kind of the I guess I could talk a little bit about what I've been doing recently with that's kind of related to that. Well, not documented. Well, actually, maybe there's that kind of goes a little bit more, I think, into some of the mappers actually on the NES. There are just so many mappers out there, and because of large, hardly any of them have a fixed timing available to them, which is super important mainly for the IRQs, which are the ways that the NES times things. So I think the most complicated one that I'm aware of is actually like the title screen of one of the Indiana Jones games, where it's using like inside of scan lines, changing colors so that it can create a sunset for title screen. And trying to get that right without having exact timing everywhere is kind of a mess. And so that's kind of the mappers, and it's also Katrinks did a lot of work on the PPU to try and fix some of the timing issues that are in there as well. Just because if you don't get all of those lined up exactly right, then you'll get flashing pixels, or you'll get the picture jumping up and down, or all these weird behaviors that can happen, and they're mainly because the timing on the IRQ or the timing in the PPU isn't done quite right. The NES, it's nice a little bit because the PPU has been decapped, and you can go look and how it behaves on real hardware. And so, like I said, Katrina has done a lot of work to make sure that the implementation that we have now is pretty close to the original. But there's still the issue with a lot of these mappers where the exact timing where that IRQ comes can be slightly off, and because nobody's gone through and decapped the
mapper.
I don't know, hundreds of different MMC chips that are out there, that it just might be a little off, and it just might mess up a pixel or a line or two.
And speaking of which, I'm going to briefly speak about what these things are for those in the audience that might not be familiar with what mappers are. They are an extension to the system that's inside of the cartridge. So when you plug in Super Mario Bros. 3, you have extra computing power in a certain way that allows the NES to do stuff that it couldn't do, like swap memory from place or make scrolls and a bunch more things. And this is extra circuitry that's not just data that expands the NES system. And Eric also mentioned decapping, and this involves taking a chip, like one of these mappers, or a CPU or a PPU. The PPU is the analog part to what a GPU today would be. It's the part of the NES that does the video and handles all video data or graphics data more properly. And you grab one of those and you somehow scrape off the copper of it. It could be laser, it could be chemical, and then you put that, the bare silicon, under a microscope and try to photograph it so that you get access to how the transistors are created and laid out in the silicon and how they connect. And developers such as Trinix and yourself, Eric, work based on that data to replicate that inside of the MiSTerFPGA, which is, I think, one of the most proper ways to do this, but it's not the only one, right? Can you tell us more about that, Eric? And correct me if I say anything.
No, that was a good summarization of what's in there. They also have expansion audio can be inside of these extra chips that are in some of the cartridges. I guess I would probably describe a mapper as basically letting you access more data than you could otherwise. So if the base system would only let you access 128 pages of a book, then these mappers let you say access 256 or 512 or 1024 pages of a book, and by sending it an extra command to say work on the first quarter of the book or the second quarter, or if I ask for something from page 1 through 10, get it from page 510 or whatever. They can do all sorts of different of remapping so that you can access a larger set of data to make the games more complex. That's kind of the first mappers were kind of basically that, and then the only other two things that they really added for the NES are that extra timer from that IRQ and extra memory, which just lets you like save data or just being able to keep track of more things at a time, or audio. So those are kind of the main things that mapper chips on the NES bring, but the way that they work is all different. So, for example, if the way that the NES is organized is it can basically send out an address and a number, and those are your commands to the mapper, and they can mean anything. And on different chips, they do mean anything. So in one chip, order 66 might be to go hunt down all the Jedi, but on another one, it might be go get me a sandwich.
And it's interesting, sorry to interrupt you, that these commands are sent to the ROM area, right?
They're sent to the cartridge PRG area, which is kind of the ROM. And if you were to have like RAM hooked up instead of ROM, then you would overwrite parts of the game and it would stop working. So yeah, that's true usually. Although they can also write to some of the areas below where the ROM is at and also be interpreted in that same way.
Interesting.
But most of them do go to the ROM area, and they would overwrite game data if you were using RAM instead of ROM, or at least if you allowed the write to go through. But yeah, that's kind of the idea behind why I don't agree with the idea that saving the ROM data is a complete picture of what's in the cartridge. If you don't know the mapper specifics, what type it is. I mean, there are several different types that are, like, a lot of them will use one type. Like there's MMC1 and MMC3 are like probably the biggest couple. At almost, I don't know the percentages off the top of my head, but a large percentage of the games will be like one of those two, or MMC0, which is basically no mapper. It just has the ROM. And so between those three, you get most of the games. But if you don't know if it's MMC1 or MMC3, then you won't know how to recreate the cartridge. So you need to have more than just the contents of those ROM chips. You need to know what other hardware was on those boards to be able to preserve what they were. And then you need to figure out how those individual mappers work so that you can preserve that too.
And it could be kind of a circular problem, right? Because I was once involved in dumping a NES game. We made an event in Mexico where people could bring CPS2 boards for me to dump and try to de-suicide. And I invited people to bring any console games that they thought could not be dumped. And they brought a NES-based home computer that had a regional software that taught about the geography of Mexico and that kind of thing. And I tried using the CopyNES to dump the cartridge. And obviously I needed to understand what the mapper did. But the thing is, it was just a blob in the cartridge covered by epoxy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's circular in the sense that if you don't know the mapper, you can't dump the game. But if you don't have a dump of the game, it's you can't correctly run the game, right? And in some cases, you can just desolder the mask ROMs and dump them and leave that, which probably was the way that these were done. Or in some others, you have to have the game running and see what it does, and just try and catch what it does in the assembly while it's running, and catch what the commands from the mapper are, right?
I'd say I agree with that. I would say that it is sometimes possible to figure out at least how the mapper works enough to dump it if you take a lot of time. I have two carts that I've got a little dumper piece of hardware that I've got. And so what I've done with two of the carts that I didn't know what kind of mapper they had to begin with, is you can dump them in their raw state to get a little chunk of the ROM, and then you can go take that to an emulator and run it and wait for it to crash, basically, and look for where it wrote basically to spots where mappers usually write to, like you were talking about in the ROM area, usually, or in the section between the audio and the ROM area. It's in one of those two places. You go look for it, and then recreate whatever writes they were doing, and then go dump it again. You usually get more data. And so you can, and then it'll crash again once you try and run that section, and then you can eventually fill out enough of the mapper to be able to say to dump the whole thing. Usually, I did that with two of the carts that I've got. It's long and annoying, and then when I was done, I figured out that they were mappers that were already described, but I didn't know what they were. So
yeah, that's what I was referring to, because you don't know unless you know how every one of those works. And based on that, even if you've dumped it, you don't have a description of what the mapper really does inside to simulate it. You just have like the black box way of dealing with it, right?
Yeah, and then like I was saying, for the IRQ, you wouldn't know the exact timing on that or anything. It's enough to get you started, but it's not enough to fully preserve it.
Yeah, Trainix mentions that Rambo 1 in Tengen Games was a good example of that kind of mapper. That's loosely understood.
Yeah, I did work on that one for a while. There's a handful of games where, and this comes up all the time. You try and fix one of them without knowing exactly how it works, and you'll fix that one, but you'll break another one. And then you try and fix those two at the same time, and you'll break a third. And then you end up in a circular thing where you break one, you fix one, you break one, you fix one. And it never works because you don't have the timing right.
Yeah, and that goes back to what kind of thing happens in the PC Engine with mappers, Dave?
Well, to be honest, the PC Engine is almost mapper free.
Almost.
Well, that is to say, it's got it's built into the processor.
Mm-hmm.
So the 6502, as most people would know, can address 64 kilobytes of RAM or of memory. And of course, if you got a 2 megabit cartridge, that's more than 64 kilobytes. So what happens is you load these registers, and you have these 8 kilobyte windows, which can be any one of 256 places in memory. So that multiplies out to 2 megabytes of memory that it can actually address. So it's actually so much easier than the NES in those terms. The only place where you have to get into mapping again was the arcade card, which added an additional, I think it was another 2 megabytes of memory to the system, but it was also banked inside of a bank.
And the Street Fighter 2 game, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I thought Street Fighter 2 had some mapping in it.
Oh, yes, you're right. That's right.
I wrote a dumper for that, and it was fun.
Yeah, it's really chunky, though. It's only 4 chunks. Five chunks, I think. But that one is so much simpler than than what Eric was just talking about.
Yeah, because it's just memory. It's memory banks, right? But what about Populous?
You mean the card or the CD?
The card.
The card. Well, it's got some memory somewhere. I'm not that familiar with it because I didn't ever try to accommodate it on the on my emulator, and I think it's already been accommodated on MiSTer before I looked at the core. So I think it's just a blob of RAM that's somewhere in memory.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah, I can't remember the exact location. I don't remember if that one was one that I or Sorgalik fixed, but it is just a little chunk of memory in there that you have to know about.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about your kind of a glimpse into some of your work, but we didn't start from the beginning. How did you get into MiSTer, Eric?
Oh, well, I guess I had around the time that the analog Super NT was coming out, I was kind of looking maybe I'd get one. I'd already looked at the MiST a little bit before that and thought, and then I decided I think that I'd wait for it to come out, and if it had support for all the cores that the Mini NT had, then I'd get one. And so I waited for it to come out, and it never had the rest of those cores. So I said, maybe I'll keep looking around. And I started looking through things and came across the MiSTer. And that at the time, I think the D10 Nano was only $100, and the memory was only 30, and so it was even considerably cheaper than just a single standalone console. So it was a pretty good deal. And then I just thinking to myself, I could probably figure out how to fix things to make this work better if I'm not satisfied with the way that it works. And I said this having never touched HDL before, so it might have been a little presumptuous of me, but I did decide to go ahead and get one, and it was first thing that I noticed about it was obviously I'm going to go for the NES first because that's the one that I grew up with and was most interested in, and sure enough, there's no saves to play Zelda, and that's just not right. So, over the course of a week or two, I started looking at at how I could put this save in there. So I started by just grabbing an emulator, creating a save, and then was looking at how I could get that memory into the core so that it could run with it. So that's the first step, is just being able to get the memory into the thing. And so that leads you into starting to understand about how an FPGA works and how it's different from programming. So I've been doing all this programming since I was a kid, and I guess the main thing that I would think about HDL is that it's basically states. If you can wrap your mind around everything happening in a state and transferring from one state to the next, everything happens on that transition. And so if you can put your mind around that transition, and that transition happens like I like to think of Ben-Hur. I don't know. There's the scene where he's on the boat, and the guy says, "Roll. We keep you alive to serve this ship. Roll well and live." And so that you've got the guy in the background with the big drums going boom, boom,
Mm-hmm.
boom, boom. And so I kind of think about this HDL running with its clock, and on every beat of that drum, you have to have your row in the right spot. And if you can get your row to the right spot, and then push the row to the, you'll know where it is at that position. And then on the next drum beat, you base where you're going to be on the next one on where you're at when that last drum beat happened. So you just think about the transition from drum beat to drum beat is where, if you want to know what you do next, if you have an add instruction, you need to look at what the state of that of your number was on the last drum beat and use that one only, and then jump to the next drum beat, and then anywhere where that uses that same value, it happens on the clock. So just think about keeping track of things in a way where it's on the drum beat is where the changes happen. If you want to look up for where something is to calculate where it's going to be at the next drum beat, use it at the last one. And so I start thinking about, okay, I need to design a state machine. And for me, the easiest way to do it was, if I think about how I want to do this in like a programming language, it's just a for loop, where it's like, take the memory, put it where you want it in the address, and add 1 to everything, and then go to the next one. So these state machines are all I have to do is say, okay, here's a state where I need to increment the address by 1. Here's a state where I need to copy the data, and here's the state where I tell it to go back to the previous state to do the next one. And so you just write a simple state machine that basically executes the same thing as a for loop. And each state is a member of that, is basically a line of code. And after debugging that for a while, it worked, and there was a save for Zelda showing up.
Nice.
So that was my introduction to HDL, was Ben-Hur.
Quite a trip. And what about you, Dave?
Getting into MiSTer. Well, I got to go back a few years. It's one of these things. When I was writing emulators, it was always, it's a race against time or at least it was on the machines of that era. So you can imagine an emulator can do anything as long as it has a sufficiently fast CPU. And sometimes that means, really, really fast. I'm not talking about the operating system additional restraints, but I knew that if you could build a circuit, it'd be great. I had heard of CPLDs and FPGAs. I didn't know anything about them for years. Somewhere in the early 2010 decade, I knew of a couple of people who were doing FPGA projects. They're mostly Japanese people doing FPGA stuff for hobbies. One guy, Kentaro Ishihara, he did several arcade boards, but they were on, very, I don't even know what kind of a system it was. Maybe he was just building it out of a Cyclone 2 FPGA and on a proto board. But I knew I wanted to get into it. I had no idea how. And I had heard of one chip MSX. I had heard of MiST over those years, and I just never really got into it. 2018 was a turning point. I had just finished a long contract, and I took some well-deserved time off in Japan in the summer. And I started to do some reading. I poked around. I was looking, and like FPGAs was like the year of FPGAs on consoles, as far as I was concerned, at least. You had the Terra Onion came out with their SSDS3, right? You had MiSTer was starting to gain some attention. It got my attention somewhere early in the year, not enough to get into it yet. And then there was a device in Japan called Uper Graphics that was very similar, did a bunch of different things and output to HDMI. And I actually met the guy who built that, and I had been doing some study at that time of the CD-ROM timings, and I spoke with him. I said, how would you like to integrate this stuff in? It'll probably solve a couple of your lingering bugs, like F1 team simulation, which at the very beginning of the program, it comes out with a horn honk, and then this really nasty noise, which is, it happens because it's playing ADPCM, and then if the CD-ROM responds too quickly and gives it new information, it hasn't finished playing the sample, and now you're corrupting the sample. And that happened. There's probably a half a dozen games that have that problem. So I gave him the code, and we were testing and adjusting and so on, and I thought it was really cool. And this work, it was all volunteer on my side. I was just helping the guy. It kind of inspired me. Here's a guy, and especially in the context of Japan, it was really shocking. This guy, he quit his job. He decided that he wanted to make a device and support himself off of that, right? Unbelievable. I mean, that's very difficult in any society, but in Japan, it's unthinkable. And here's a guy with a lot of guts. So I thought that was really cool, and it inspired me. And I thought, maybe I'll get back into electronics a little bit. Things are more accessible now. I should get myself a proper soldering iron instead of that fire stick from 40 years ago. And so I started to ease myself into Arduino stuff, and I got a MiSTer around Christmas of 2018, but not really a MiSTer, but a bunch of blank boards because everything was in short supply at that time. And I said, I'm going to build this myself. And I managed to do it. It was harder than I thought it would be, but I had no skills. Right? So I built those skills, and I wouldn't be too concerned about doing it again now, but it's not something I would want to do for other people. MiSTer, the coding, I mean, of course, it had a TurboGrafx core, and by the way, it should be called PC Engine. But anyway, it's got that core, and at that time, it still had some of the items that Eric was mentioning earlier, the Wonder Momo and some of the other things. And I thought, okay, let me tinker with this. And of course, I was able to fix some things, but I also broke some things because there was that missing information. But just tinkering, as Eric said, just tinkering is exactly what you need as a starting HDL coder. Right? I've been programming computers for decades. How hard can HDL be? Well, it can be hard, but it's just another language. It's just another way of thinking. If you're a developer and you can't learn something new, what good are you? Sorry if I was a little harsh.
No, it's just a painful process, right? But let's be empathetic about it. I mean, yeah, you need to do that, but it's hard to bootstrap yourself and.
Oh yeah. No, this is a paradigm shift, definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's not something you can pick up in a day, and like, let's make that clear. But
it's painful.
But it's not going to happen if you keep putting it off either.
Yeah, I need to go that way someday.
Well, the best place to start is find a bug that's really bothering you that you think you know how to fix. Okay, and then work to fix it. Now, in MiSTer, there's a bunch of things that are kind of voodoo black magic that maybe nobody knows about. Honestly, I was talking with Kitrinks last night about a behavior that the scaler has on HDMI when the resolution changes. There's a flash of junk that comes up, and I saw this on the East Book 1 and 2 title screen, and it's just a minor annoyance. It's just a flash for like one frame, but it's enough to bother me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's sort of voodoo black magic. Nobody goes into the scaler kind of a thing, right? And the communication between the system on a chip and the FPGA backend, that's that's something that takes a fair bit of digestion. One of the things, and as a software developer, one of the things that I've noticed, and this is not unique to MiSTer, this is on every FPGA project I've ever seen. It's like the 1980s. You know, every variable is like X, X1, CE, Q, and there's no comments. And this is driving me crazy. So keep that in mind, and please be nice and add comments. Like if you're doing something that, okay, if somebody knows what you're doing, it's easy to figure out why you're choosing that value. Great, but at least tell them what you're trying to do. So I try to do that whenever I'm writing something. A core that I wrote for my own benefit, but also for the benefit of others, is the Adc Test. What I took the template core and I made minimal changes to it, but I commented what I did as much as I thought reasonable. And what it does is just kind of a really primitive oscilloscope based on what you see on the ADC. So if you're playing like a cassette into a core, you might remember from the old days playing a cassette into an old computer, getting the volume level right was a big deal. So, and you could never visualize it back then. So I wrote ADC tests so we could kind of say, yeah, is a volume in an acceptable range before I play it back into my computer core and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's important because if you saturate, you create harmonics that destroys everything, right?
Yeah, and if you don't reach the threshold in the first place, it's not going to detect anything.
Yeah, so it's a range, and yeah, comments are a big part. I sometimes browse. I browse MAME source code a lot, to be honest, and sometimes you see amazing documentation in there that's like another world for a PCB board, right? The only way to fix it is there. And sometimes it's just the memory mapping and that's it. But it's hard. Getting good documentation, it's hard.
Well, and it's never consistent on a big project.
No, and when you're hacking into something, it's the last thing you want to deal with. But we need to do that, right? As developers.
I think so. I mean, if we're hoping for other people to join us and also write cool stuff, I mean, it's our obligation.
It's the same. We've all seen that happen to ourselves as developers. You go back to a project 10 years old by yourself, and you need to understand yourself, and that's not easy.
That's how I learned that it was a good thing to do.
Yeah.
Of course, it was reinforced working at a bank with a team, many of whom really needed a lot of things described in great detail. But that's what makes the world go round. There's a lot of variation among people, and we need to kind of make it clear.
Yeah. And one of the machines that did use a cassette, I believe, is the Atom. And the Atom is ColecoVision, and you started with the ColecoVision, right, Eric?
No, I well, sort of. The TI-99 foray that I mentioned is kind of my first computer. Was kind of another motivating thing for me to get the MiSTer, was just because I wanted a TI-99 core, and I figured the only way that I could get one was to write one myself. But I didn't want to start with writing a whole core from scratch, which is why I started doing some simple things with the NES core. So adding saves, and then there was this other audio bug where it wasn't playing high notes, and like the fix for that was pretty simple if you understand the logic of how the bug was introduced. So if you think about it and say, if you're writing something that says, tell me yes or no if this number is greater than or equal to 10, and you say, well, one way to do that is just to say, are there any digits past the first one to the left of the first digit that isn't 0? But that's kind of easier than saying on a CPU, the only other way to do that is to subtract. You say the number that you've got and you subtract 10, and you say, is that number greater than or less than 0 when you're done subtracting? But it's easier and simpler in logic to just say, I have any digits to the left that are not 0. And so if you look at what this bug is, it's they had gone in and done the equivalent of saying, it needed to say, is this greater than or equal to 10? And so they said, oh, I'll just count the number of digits to the left if it's more than 1. And so they dropped the right digit, but then they kept the greater than or equal to 10. So basically that turns into a greater than or equal to 100. If you can, if you think about how that works, you did the greater than or equal to 10, and then you say, oh, is the numbers that are dropped a digit greater than or equal to 10? You've actually now said, is that number greater than or equal to 100? That's why all of the high notes on the NES at one point were missing. It's because there's this, it cuts it off after a certain high frequency, but they had outthought themselves. They had simplified it and then kept the original harder way of doing it and combined it into one broken thing. But I'm still grateful for the NES core. I think was originally by Strigius, the FPGA NES core that got ported to the MiST and then to the MiSTer. I'm still grateful for people that had done that, because then it gives me something simple that I can look at for bugs, that I can get my way around HDL, started understanding how it works and making improvements here and there. So anyway, after that one, like I said, I had wanted a TI-99 core, and I still didn't think I was ready to write one, but at that point, I found that somebody else had already created one for a different FPGA, and that's Speckery, also known as Eric Peel, had created this TI-99 core that already existed, and I thought, well, maybe porting something isn't as bad as trying to create one from scratch. And then I started looking around and realizing that the chips that the TI-99 4A uses, the audio and the video, are the exact same chips that are used in ColecoVision and in Sega SG-1000. That if you those two systems are almost identical. Not only do they share the video and audio chips, they also have the same Z8 processor. The only really difference is how they're wired up. So recognizing that the ColecoVision had the same audio and video as the TI-99, and the hardest part of hooking up a new core there's three things. One is the audio. Two, well, not in order. One is the audio, two is the video, and three is the RAM, the memory. Those are the three hardest things to hook up. And because the ColecoVision already existed at this point, all I had to do was go in and say, replace the CPU and replace the connecting logic. And because the TI-99 used such little amount of memory, I could use the block RAM that's built into the FPGA without having to mess with the SD RAM or the DDR, which are more complicated to deal with. So because these chips are all the same and already existed in the thing, I could have used Eric Peel's version of the audio and video as well, but it was easier to just leave the one that was already connected to MiSTer, had all the signals going where they're supposed to go. The audio is already hooked up, the video is already hooked up. All you have to do is swap out the CPU and fix the connecting logic that did come directly from Eric Peel's version, and it worked faster than it should have. I would have expected to have had problems, but it came up pretty quickly. So
nice.
The only part of it that was hard at the time was that this was back before the scaler that Dave was talking about, before Greyrogue had implemented that thing, and that meant that all of the cores that you were building without if you didn't have a license, if you had the light version, only ran for an hour, and then they would blank the video on you, or you could run it with the I/O board. That still worked without a time limit, but I didn't have one of those at the time. Although, big thumbs up to Alan for. I mentioned that at some point when I was working on the NES core, I think, or maybe it was on the TI-99. Anyway, he sent me an I/O board, so big thanks to Alan for saving me countless hours of debugging with the light one. But yeah,
I think
Alan was just.
Alan's done a lot for the community. He's really pulled a lot of us together, I think.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
So anyway, it really helps that a lot of these systems use a lot of the same chips, and that we can reuse them. And then I did actually end up, while I was working on the T99, find a bug in the sprite processing on that video chip, and so that can then go back and fix the same thing in the ColecoVision and the SG-1000.
A sprite issue, right?
Sprite issue, yeah. There was it's minor, like it only shows up in I think like the one game on a TI-99 that I found where it relies on the way that what happens when the number of sprite overflows per line per line.
Mhm.
I think it's per line where it overflows, and then what the number that it returns in a register is different than what the existing implementation of that chip said. And so when I fixed that on the TI-99 game, I could push that out to the ColecoVision and SG-1000 core.
Good. Several things at once.
Yeah.
And from that, you jumped into the TurboGrafx PC Engine.
Yeah. So once I had the TI-99 working, my next thought is, what can I do with minimal effort that would have some effect? I'm like that. I maximum bang for my buck. What can I do that I won't have to spend a lot of time and get some immediate positive feedback? And so Dave mentioned that there isn't mappers for the PC Engine except for Street Fighter, but there is some complexity in the way that it handles some of these smaller games, like the ones that are 3/4 of the size and the ones that are like 3/8 of a size. Way that it maps those is a little non-intuitive, and it turns out that the core, again, this one was originally written by Torless, had this problem, and there was a bug reported that showed a lot of the games, and I was looking through this list and noticing that a lot of them are the same size, and they happen to be these 3/4 size games or these 3/8 size games. And so I was like, this sounds a lot like the issue where of that main game, the Hot Rod that I was talking about before. It sounds like this might be a thing to look at, because I can imagine that because these are all the same size games that are failing, I could go look and see if it's doing the logic there correctly. And sure enough, there was a problem with the way that it handled. First of all, Street Fighter 2 wasn't quite right, and then all of these kind of in-between size games weren't mapped correctly. And so a couple of lines of code, and all of a sudden you've got 50 more games that are booting up and running.
Nice.
And it's just kind of, yeah, easy fix. All these things didn't take very long. Fun. And then you get hooked on it, and you do it for several more months instead of moving on to something else. So.
Speaking of which, you worked on a compiler to build games after what you told us earlier, Dave. And this compiler generates the ROM sizes that can fit into these non-standard or intermediate sizes, right? What can you tell us about this compiler?
Well, in the late 90s, there was really the three emulator authors, we'll say, for the PC Engine. We had David Michel, we had Olivier Joly, who was known as Zeograd at that time, and myself. I mean, I gave up on my emulator, the first of the three, but we were all still questing to know more about the system. And David Michel, he had somehow found a 6502 assembler, or maybe he wrote it, and that's how he was running some tests on the system to get more information to improve his emulator. But he said, you know what would be really cool is I found this C compiler from the 80s, no attribution. We don't know where it came from, but I was toying around with adding a few little bits onto it, and I think I can get PC Engine stuff coming out. So we worked, the three of us, on Hue C to try and see. Well, it was from the beginning a story of trying to write a game, trying to get something out there, and so people could write their own stuff and be creative. And I spent a lot of time working on the startup, the library for the system, so that it would dual boot either HuCard or CD-ROM. A lot of time on optimization of speed. Now, anybody who thinks that C is going to go well on an 8-bit processor, you got to think two problems with C. I don't really want to necessarily go too technical, but C is a very stack-based language, and on a 6502, stack is not that fast. And the second thing is int. What's the size of your int? Well, if they had declared int to be 8 bits, it would have been great, but it's not. so everything was, well, let's try and use A and X together in this way and swap and add, and we'll make macros. And so it was really kind of slow, but you could write stuff really quick. It just wouldn't run really quick. Now, having said that, there's probably about 12 or 15 games that have been released, like professionally pressed on the system since the year 2000 or so. That I think all of them are using QC as their basis. So I guess it went somewhere.
Yeah, sure it did. It's I believe it's an amazing tool, and it brings a lot of power to the community that goes round into trying to figure out stuff from inside the console, so that it can be properly documented in so many ways, right? When you're developing this, when you're creating these tools and these simulators, and later on for testing stuff from inside the machine.
Yeah, when I use QC, I mean I don't use it very much, but I'm writing little test programs, and it's really fast to get a scaffolding up to start displaying text on the screen. Whereas if you were doing that in assembler, it would be excruciating. But the cool part about it is you can just make some inline assembler and that's probably it's probably 60% of my programs when I'm writing.
Yeah, you get bootstrapped and then you can do stuff inside.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
And I know that you did some work on QC at a later stage.
Yeah, way later, like 16 years after you had worked on it. I figured out just like Eric was saying. I wanted the 243P test suite. That's software I've created in the past, and it was created in QC for the version of PC Engine, of course. And I wanted it to run on every single variant or version, so I made a CD-ROM version because it was easier to find a CD-ROM and burn it 8 years ago than to get a flash card. And that will open the door to have access to this CRT and scalar calibration tools. So I use QC, and I made a CD-ROM version and a super CD-ROM version so that it would work on either. But working on the CD-ROM versions, I noticed that I simply ran out of banks way too soon.
Mm-hmm.
And it was because whenever a bank was partially full, or a function name or data wouldn't fit into the next bank, it simply opened a new bank and started making one, and you ran out of banks too soon. So I went into this trying to fix it, and obviously it's an MP complete problem to try to fit data into standard bins. But there are approximations, so I worked that into the compiler so that you get an approximation of a decent enough solution to pack everything into each one of these bins. That's the kind of thing that I was working on QC, and not anything big, but it can help some CD-ROM projects. But sure. I love working on the PC Engine and QC.
It's a great system.
Yeah, it is. And thing is that the PC Engine and the TurboGrafx have improved a lot in the last 3 years on MiSTer, thanks to both of you guys, right?
Well, I was saying the other day, I know that we both played with the version, the 2019 version. When SRG 320, Sergey came up with the new version, it was like the veil had lifted, just a masterpiece. I look at that core and I say that's SRG 320 and Sorgelig's core. I'm just waxing the car and vacuuming the inside.
Yeah, I remember back then when I was working on it, I got those games to work all of a sudden, and then I had started working on some of there was a CPU bug about, I don't remember the specifics, something where where it was handling the interrupt and it didn't handle it at the exact right time inside the CPU, and I adjusted something like that, and that would fix some things. And then And then I started trying to work on on the video a little bit, and we get back into the same thing where it's okay, I fixed it, and then I go and I try up the next game that I want to fix, and I fixed it. Oh wait, I broke the last one, and you get into this cycle again where you fix some things and then you break some things. I remember specifically the two things that really were stopping me from making any progress were again those like Dave was talking about, those wait states on like memory access and whatever are super important, and I didn't know what they were, didn't have hardware to go test them, and probably didn't have the motivation either. But it was that, and then the timing on the what is it, the RCR IRQ or whatever that thing was called. There's a couple of IRQs that you have to.
Yeah, the IRQ2 is it's shared between the VBlank and the raster counter.
Yeah, the raster counter, that raster counter IRQ, trying to figure out exactly when that fired, and I couldn't figure it out. So I'd go through and I'd fix some, trying to time it right and breaking some, and then it got to the point where I had fixed, a lot more games were running than were before. I think that that had suddenly got Sorgelig's interest a little bit, and so he started trying to fix some things too, and he then decided that all of a sudden he'd go make the super graphics work, and that was pretty cool. It was like, that's the point where I think people really started to get a little bit excited about it, was when all of a sudden, super graphics. But it was funny because so I'd gone through the cycle of fixing games and breaking them. Sorgelig had gone and done the super graphics, and then he was also trying to do the same thing where he was fixing games. And I think there's a certain, if you go looking at the GitHub, there's probably a certain spot where you'll notice some games are mentioned being fixed multiple times, where I would go through the circle, fixing and breaking, and then Sorgelig went through that same circle, fixing games, breaking them, fixing them, breaking them, where because you just don't have the timings, and you just don't know the right way to fix it, you just never get there. And so, yeah, the eventual work that SRG 320 did on there to actually figure out what those right values are means that you no longer have to go in circles.
And this goes back to one of the main ideas that we've been talking about, that it's documentation from the canonical source, right? Because you don't know if somebody will write some software in 10 years and it won't work on real hardware, but will work on emulators, right? Only with documentation you can do this, and with proper canonical documentation from the hardware.
Oh, exactly. I mean, everything that I learn about the system, I make public. I want emulator people to include it in their emulators. I want to put it into all the FPGA systems. I want all of these systems to look the same, really. And there's no really good reason other than motivation why they shouldn't be. At this point in time, with the amount of power that's available on computers, with the amount of power that's available in FPGAs.
Yeah, which is also circular in terms of if we can document it and as a whole community get it better everywhere, then these mistakes won't be replicated, or this information can be spreaded everywhere, right?
Yeah, I think on the PC Engine, one thing that we're a little bit light on in general, Chris Covell's written a bunch of really good testers, like
yes.
Things that you can run to validate that your CPU runs 3 cycles for all of the 3 cycle opcodes, for example. But yeah, he's probably coded for about 10% of the actual system, and I don't think really anybody else has written stuff like that. Whereas I've heard of lots of test programs for machines like the NES and the SNES.
I agree. Chris's work has been pivotal and fundamental for a lot of this work, because he thought about so many things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And regarding MiSTer, it's also interesting that the analog out from this core and from many cores is so close to the real one.
Yeah. That was you want to talk about the palette from last summer?
Yeah, it would be interesting. Do you know about the palette changes that were made, Eric?
I do actually. When I was I had been working on it, like I said, in around that time back when, and I had seen in the documentation where it said that there was a, this translation layer that happens between composite, or between RGB and composite, and there's this tantalizingly small table in the document that I saw that has like 2 lines, ... and then the last 2 lines.
Yeah, that's the
and
patent.
then I was like, yeah, and the patent. And you go look at that and you're like, oh, where's the rest of it? And so I had just seen it, but I was like, and then I glanced at it, said, oh, I don't see an obvious pattern. And so I moved on.
So,
That was
so
my exposure to it.
yeah, the first time I heard about this was maybe 2015, and it was from a couple of people who made some oblique comment, oh, the RGB isn't quite right. And I didn't know what they were talking about, and I thought, you guys are just pulling my leg.
You're just jealous that we have RGB and you have composite. But
I was playing on a computer at the time.
let me use this this moment because I interrupted you. But if somebody in the audience right now wants to ask questions, just send them to the chat and we'll work through them. But meanwhile, we'll continue with this story. Sorry for interruption, Dave.
No problem. So actually, one of the people who had told me way back when was he's had so many handles over the years, but he's calling himself Turbo X-Ray these days. And last summer, he presented me with a screenshot that was irrefutable. And it was a game called Startling Odyssey 2. And I had never seen this comparison before. And I thought, oh my God, it's true. So then I, like a project manager, because that's what I do these days, I decided to gather the troops. So I put it on Twitter and I said, I learned today that RGB that we've been using all these years is not right. And of course, gasps of dismay. Oh, you're full of it. These kinds of comments and queries, but it certainly got people thinking. And Vertec, who does decapping, I'm not sure where he got the chips from anymore, but he had decapped a couple of chips, and he has his own microscope, and he was doing some tracing out, and the standard cells inside of these chips are not that easy to decode. But I said, do you have any idea? Do we have something on the 6260 that we can try to figure out what this decode table is? Because we had the picture, we had the patent that, as Eric says, so tantalizingly teases us that it has some information. And it was just a few hours. Like, this guy was a genius. He was playing with test pins and trying to I don't know how he figured it out, but he managed to read the ROM of the colors. He wrote a little program that would display all the different colors, and he would read from the ROM at the time when that color was being displayed, and he would find that it was a different value than he originally thought. And he says, oh, this must be the value. So he looked it up and he compared it against the values that were listed in the patent. And he says, yeah, this is your table, I think. So can you check it out? And so we started playing with that. And then, Artemio, we went on your Discord, talking about 240p, and man, it was a big team. I think Kitrinks was doing all this math transformation. Solten G42 was also talking about that. Turbo X-Ray was there. I wrote a test program. Turbo X-Ray wrote a test program. You had all your vector scopes out, testing, trying different variations. And it was one of those things where we're not quite sure what we're looking for. So we went down about 250 different avenues.
It's interesting because everybody brought a different way of dealing with the issue from their own background, right? There was Tianfong. It also Bernard was using digital oscilloscopes, and because his background is on video, and Gutrenix wrote this software oscilloscope to decode the images from the frame buffer or from any screen capture, sorry. And and we were measuring different systems with your test programs on the vector scope and checking how they match the standards. And this is a small game. It was so obvious, just as you say, how the bands in the sky were lost when using RGB. That it was such an interesting time to be working on that, because it seemed to me that every one of us was day and night, every single hobby hour that we have, we put into that. And it felt so, I don't know, magical, in the sense that we were carrying each other into this vortex of collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that went on for about 6 weeks, didn't it?
Oh, I think so, or even a bit more. But yeah, that kind of time frame.
But yeah, I mean, it's finding the solutions to those problems. It's really exhilarating, I think.
But the thing is that MiSTer was the place where this could be accommodated, and where they would pay attention to this detail for an implementation and the proper decoding of the information, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's funny, you get these communities of around emulators, I think, and at a certain point they become a little bit more brittle,
Yeah.
right? I worked very much with the author of Mednafen about a decade ago, and we had a kind of a collaboration going on IRC. But when IRC kind of went the way of the dodo, it's like I lost my ability to contribute to that project. So when I come up with the CD delays,
Mm-hmm.
that information just didn't get integrated, and other things didn't get integrated. But they already knew that this palette was coming, so they had built a backdoor for it. So I'm not sure how they knew that the palette was coming. I guess they just kind of forecast it.
Yeah, but it's fortunate that it did, and well, the result was this awesome palette that's the default for the core, and you can also load any custom palettes because it's possible, and the option is there, and you can also get the RGB palette if you want to, right, and switch between them and see how they differ on the MiSTer, and thankfully in many other devices today, which is good. It's really good.
Mm-hmm.
And on the same
I
app,
always wonder how many of those are the ones that actually work on real hardware that also implement the black and white on there.
Yeah.
I don't know how common that is for hardware. Do you guys know that? Like, there is that black and white
Yes.
switch that you can turn on, which on the composite will turn off the color carrier, so you get black and white. I'm curious how many of the
Games.
RGB on the actual hardware implement that.
You mean of the emulators, or you mean the standard game set?
Yeah,
Like
he means the hardware mods, I guess.
Yeah, the ones that give you RGB out of the actual hardware.
Oh, yeah,
I wonder how many of those actually implement that.
pretty sure it's probably 0.
I should be able to answer that, but I don't remember, because I tested that, but it was like 8 years ago when I coded the switch.
It was one of the other weird things that I'd implemented in the core was adding that black and white, and because of the way it works, while I was looking at it, I wondered how many of the actual hardware mods actually.
I'll confirm that for you when we finish the transmission, because I have several mods here, and I coded that into the suite as an option, so it's easy to test. I don't remember, and it's weird that I don't remember if it changed. I think it never changes in RGB, but that's my memory.
There's at least one game that
Bailey's.
I think it it does like a black and white photo or something like that.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a
Bailey's,
very
right?
it's not an important scene, but yes, I think I recall hearing about that.
Yeah,
I can't remember which game it is though.
And the PC Engine also has several other things, like that filter that makes composite output not flicker as much, right?
Yes. Yeah, so that one, what it does on the composite output, and there's another patent that deals with that, it offsets the start of line by a fraction of a pixel on alternating fields.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, you get 60 fields per second, not 60 frames. It's 30 frames per second. And on alternating fields, you get alternating lines. So these alternating lines wouldn't be exactly aligned. They'd be slightly jagged, but that would actually create a kind of an interference against slightly pink or slightly blue at the edge.
Yeah, it reduces the noise, basically. Because the interference that Dave is talking about is created by the carrier. And it cleans up in a magical way, cancels out that kind of interference.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think Mike Chi worked some magic with that on the RetroThink. I need to check that.
I heard that the 5X is like amazing. I haven't got one myself though.
Yeah, Mike did go into the chat a bit to help us out decoding with MATLAB the composite values for the palette as well. Yeah, so also on terms of PC Engine, I recall that when I got my MiSTer, I reported some kind of offsets switching fastly in a PBM between the PC Engine and the core, and those were like quickly fixed. Like also the bottom line 240, is never drawn on hardware, only up to 239, and MiSTer was drawing it, and when we documented it, reported it with oscilloscope output and everything, it was fixed in a matter of less than a week. And that was amazing.
Yeah, especially just after the release, everything was like hours.
Yeah.
And I mean, I want the core to be perfect for my own reasons. And maybe I should make this statement. I'm not doing this for other people. I'm doing this for myself. But everybody can share in the benefits.
Of course. And I think that's the way that things usually work for every one of us, right, Eric?
Oh yeah, I do it for myself more than I absolutely want other people to enjoy it, but I'm doing it mainly for me. It's fun.
And it's also the same reason that I built MD Fourier. I was interested on fixing stuff so that people that said that the Genesis sounded bad would at least compare to a real sounding Genesis before making that opinion. Because most emulators didn't or don't have the proper FN sound, right? But that's it. It's basically a personal reason that you can extrapolate to others and get the ball rolling, and it becomes very interesting when a community is also interested in this, right? And Flamesbit, hey Flamesbit, asks us if what's your favorite PC Engine game or games? Guilty pleasure? And do you still play or spend all your time tinkering and fixing bugs?
I guess this is for me.
Well, the second part of the question we can still ask Eric. But please ask first, Dave.
Well, my first and always love of a game is Ys Book 1 and 2. It was magical when I first saw it, and I'm actually playing through it right now. I should mention that I'm trying to make my way through as much of the PC Engine library on the MiSTer core as possible to try and see if there's any additional bugs. But yeah, Ys 1 and 2 and Ys 4, the English translation, my favorites. Guilty pleasure. Yeah, I don't think I have a guilty pleasure on it. I mean, okay, maybe any shooter. I'm terrible at shooters, but I love them. And do I still play or spend all my time tinkering? Well, you know what? Over the last 30 years, I probably spent tons more time tinkering and collecting than playing, but I've been getting back into playing a little bit more lately.
That's good. Ys 1 and 2 was also my first PC Engine game. I bought it and I didn't have TurboGrafx, but I kept it, and I made some fan art and drawings and imagined how good it would be. And it was like, you wouldn't believe this, but I bought my Magic Engine license to play that game and Snatcher, and later on, I bought a Turbo Duo like 1 year later when I could.
Yeah, I believe it totally. But I mean, Ys Book 1 and 2, probably the first CD-ROM game that I ever saw, and what an impression it made.
Yeah, the intro is amazing, and the music and the game, everything. And I'm going to move on to Eric in a minute, but I wanted to ask you, do you play the new Ys games, Dave? Ys 8, Ys 9?
You mean the PC ones?
No, well, or PS4 or whatever.
So, yeah, actually, I love Falcom in general, and I've been buying all of the games, but I was disappointed in Ys 6.
Okay.
But the other ones I've played bits and pieces of. For me, it's usually pretty hard to find the time to play. I know they're short games anyway, but the art in them is just so beautiful.
Play 8. Do yourself a favor and play 8.
Okay.
And 9. I love them. Do that.
Okay.
It's.
I was worried that they were getting a little bit repetitious, but
No.
On the basis of your recommendation, I'll go out and get them.
I love them. Yeah. The Ys 8 is an extraordinary game, and 9 is an incredible sequel to it. So, sorry about that. Eric, I know that you probably don't have favorite PC Engine games. If you do, please let us know. But do you still play, or spend all your time tinkering?
So while I was working on it, I did play a few games that I liked. I'm obviously a Zelda fan, so of course I'm going to gravitate towards
Neotopia.
Neotopia 1 and 2. I think I finished the first one and almost finished the second one. I need to go back and finish that one. And then, just like the comment Mikey Vids just said, Blazing Lasers. It's a great game. I probably played that one more than anything else, especially because there was a bug in it that was trying to fix. But I really liked it because it's a fun game. So
it is. It is a really fun game. It has a different name in the PC Engine.
Yeah, it's based on a TV show or something, or an anime, right? Gunhead.
That's exactly right. And music is amazing. It's by Compile, but published by Hudson, and it was like white labeled. And stage shade with those bubbles. That's amazing. Love that game.
I know one of the reasons that Sorgalig was interested in working on that core after I started working on it also is because he started playing some of it and found the shooters. Apparently, he's a big shooters fan. So
good. I'm also a big shooter fan. I'm terrible at them, but I love them. So
I'm not very good at them either, but they're fun. They're fun.
They are.
Yeah. As far as working or playing more, since I got the MiSTer, I spent way more time improving, fixing, trying to fix, rebreaking, whatever than I've spent playing on it actually, and a lot of that's just because the actual fixing of bugs is to me like
addictive.
The best puzzle game ever.
I was just going to say that it's the best puzzle game.
I mean, I'm over here picturing myself like some hard-nosed detective, looking around for clues. Who's got the fixes in here? What's going wrong? And you get to spend time logically looking through things, trying to figure out where the issue can be. And when you actually find that fix, it's a good feeling.
It is.
It's a good feeling.
I think a lot of people can totally empathize with that. And Flinsbit says that you will go back to Kid's Courage. Do you like Kid's Courage?
Me, I played it when it first came out, but it's not. I don't think it was a very good pack-in game.
Yeah, it wasn't. But it looked pretty. That it did.
Yeah, well, if you wanted to ask me about an unpopular game that I liked B-Ball, which came over here as Chu Man Fu.
Yeah, it's an amazing game.
Yeah, it was not popular, but...
No, but it's a lot of puzzles, it's fun, music is good, and it gets complicated fast.
And there's a strategy.
Yes. Yeah, it's this puzzle game where you are pushing a ball and you need to get to goals, like different color balls to different color receptacles and their enemies. That kind of game. Top down. Great game.
Yeah.
And then, Eric, you moved on to Sega Master System.
Yeah. I don't have a lot to say about that one because if you're going to put a Sega Master System in front of me and an NES, then I'm almost always going to go for the NES. But the one exception to that is actually probably Golden Axe Warrior. Again, I'm a Zelda fan, so Golden Axe Warrior was right up my alley. So I did start adding some fixes for that. Added more like extra sprite support on that and fixing games. And then at some point, I think it turns out that I looked around and the Game Gear was remarkably simple to add. It's like you expand the number of bits that you use for the colors and you add stereo sound and you're done. You got a Game Gear. So it was remarkably easy to do, and you know me, an easy win, minimal work, I'm there. So yeah, worked on that for a little while until again sort of like started seeing some things over there, and he started testing some things, and then he started fixing things, and so I thought I'd get out of there before he started through the same cycle of fixing and breaking things again. So I moved on after that.
Yeah, and I love Phantasy Star on the Sega Master System, and Ghostbusters. I kind of grew up with those and the Shinobi port. But yeah, it's a machine that doesn't get much love because it was not quite as remarkable as the PC Engine in certain ways. But it was a stepping stone for the Genesis that would come later on.
Yeah, I think that one was originally by FPGA Hacks, or Ben. Just shout out to the original creators again, because it's fun to work on the ones that have already been put out there to go find fixes for. Is easier for me anyway than starting from scratch.
And we always need both profiles, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and after that, you moved on to NES.
Yeah, I went back to do some more NES stuff. The other thing that I wanted to mention specifically, is Loopy. If you go and look at through a lot of the stuff that I added into the NES, an enormous chunk of that is from on the NES Dev forums goes by Loopy. He's been big into NES emulation for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I think he makes still makes the FDS sticks.
Oh, those are great. I have one, and man, lifesavers.
And a lot of the stuff that he's like that, the code that's on that FDS stick, I think has a lot of a lot of the stuff that I took from him was the Power Pack drivers that he wrote for different mappers, and so they're all just sitting there, and I'm like, once again, minimal work. Go grab them, fix them up so that they work with the way that the MiSTer works, and find any fixes for them. And so a lot of the expansion audio originally came from Loopy. I think Katrinks went through and fixed, like the FDS was got some better documentation later on, and I think she went and fixed that one. And there's some other ones that we both kind of worked on. But she did a lot of that too. Where you get the expansion audio from. Originally, though, those were a lot of it came about quickly because of Loopy and his open sourced mappers for the Power Pack.
That's awesome. It helps everybody.
Yep.
Having that, and also, as you said, Trainix has done a lot of work as well on several areas regarding the NES core. And you did fixes even to the CPU and PPU, right?
Yeah. The actual FPGA. Actually, I didn't write that one down. I should have. Whoever the 6502 core is pretty well vetted. It's been through a lot. I guess more than one person actually. So a lot of people should be credited, I guess. But even in there, I found some places where there were reset differences. I think mainly in the CPU. I know one of those I fixed, and then I don't think it got pushed back to the main repository where that thing lives. And so when somebody upgraded that one, it lost that fix, and I had to fix it again. I think for one of the Zelda ROM hacks. I think so. There's one spot in there in the reset that I know pretty well because it keeps breaking. But
you always have to go back to that leak.
Yeah. I gotta make sure that anytime somebody touches the code that they didn't pull that fix out. So
Trainix says it's Legend of Link.
Yeah, that one. Yep.
And Mundandy asks us if there are any features or mappers that you guys would like to add to the core, the NES core. Might even things like the Famicom PC that gave you facts about Mexico, he mentions.
At this point, as far as mappers go, there aren't a lot more that are interesting to me. I wouldn't probably, but part of it is just my thinking is mappers are actually really easy to write. And it's a good, if anybody ever comes to me and says, what can I do to start learning? And I'm going to say, go find a game that, a weird Chinese or weird ROM hack that doesn't work, that doesn't have the mapper in it. Go find one that you think might be interesting to play for 5 minutes and and go write the mapper for it, because it's really not that hard. You can go look at the some of the existing ones to see how they work. You go look up most of them are documented on NestDev, and so you could just go in there and you kind of spend a little while looking at it, and you could get started learning how to do it. So I kind of see a lot of the remaining mappers, because they're mostly for weird homebrews or ROM hacks or
bootleg
multi-carts or things like that. I kind of see those as like almost saving them for somebody who wants to get started. And because there's so many of them, I know I'd get burnt out if I tried to do too many more of them. So as far as me personally, I probably have most of the ones that I want done, so I probably won't do too many more. I have been working a little bit with MIDI stuff on it, though. That was the thing I think that got me invited today, was that a couple weeks ago I added MIDI support to the NSF player on there, so you can now hook up any MIDI player, keyboard, Yamaha, or the Miracle Piano that originally was intended to work with the NES, and you can go in there and play an NSF file, so it'll play the actual NES music, and then on top of that, you can play the pulse channel and the triangle channel with the keyboard over the top of it. It's just a little project that I'd been threw together over a couple of weeks, and thought it was interesting. The reason that the Miracle Piano is interesting to me personally is, I don't know if you know who TMR is, the Mexican runner.
Yeah, of course.
His project a while back was to beat every single NES game that was licensed in North America and Europe. And I was watching him do this for a while, and he was banging away on that Miracle Piano, which is the cart that lets you basically learns how to play the piano. It tracks what notes you hit and whatever. And there were 2 sections in that game where he couldn't beat him, no matter how perfectly he played. And so later on, I started digging through with an emulator. I started digging through the cartridge and running through it. I found those 2 specific sections, and I actually figured out that the game is broken in those 2 sections. If you play them exactly right, you fail. There's like 2 tricks you have to do. Like one of them, you have to, like, there's a pause when it switches pages on these, and if you play like the pause isn't there, like you play ahead of when it's telling you to play at a constant rate, then you'll pass it on that one. And then on the other one, there's like some tied notes where you're supposed to hold it. But if you actually hold it, then you lose. You have to actually let go on a couple of, so those, I dug into that, and ever since then I've got a soft spot for the Miracle Piano. So.
And did you ever tell him?
I don't think so. This I didn't figure it out until like a couple of years after he had finished. So I watched him, and then it had bugged me for a long time, and eventually I dug into it with an emulator, and then so when the MiSTer came along, I was like, okay, I got to make sure it supports the Miracle Piano.
That's awesome. And how would they go to connect a Miracle Piano to it?
So it actually connects through the controller port, but the signals that are sitting there are pure MIDI. So
nice.
Anything that talks MIDI can work the same way. Like the way that it's hooked up in the NES core on MiSTer is you can take a Yamaha keyboard, hook it up through the MIDI interface, and it'll send the commands over to the Miracle Piano cart just like the normal Miracle Piano does. Works fine.
That's awesome. I'll be sure to make that information reach the TMR.
Oh, okay. I don't know that he'd be interested in going back and trying those.
No. I guess he'll hate it, but it'll be fun telling him.
That's kind of what I figured.
I mean, I'm not a personal friend of his, but I know him, and I know people that are friends of him, so I'll let him know.
Yeah. So you can tell him though that it wasn't his fault he couldn't beat him.
That's the idea. That's the idea.
Is the game is broken in those 2 sections.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I want to tell him. Or well, he to get that information. And going back, Dave, to the original question, Is there stuff or features for PC Engine that you'd like to add to the course, taking that same question from Moon Dandy?
Yes, sort of. One thing because there was a discussion on the boards a couple of weeks ago about CD plus G that kind of sparked my interest, so I'm looking into it.
Oh,
that's one thing. There are some developer type things that probably wouldn't make it into the core, but I would use on my own. I'm always interested in really weird peripherals, and one, again, this wouldn't necessarily be a core thing, but one thing I'm also taking a quick peek at is, I mentioned the Devereaux book earlier, and how it's got a CD-ROM and it connects to a computer, but it used a COM port and an LPT port from, that would have been common on a 1990s computer, but you can't find a computer that has those anymore. So I was thinking of making a little adapter that does that over USB, and I think it's possible to do that so that you can write programs, download them directly into the machine. One of the things it also liked to do was it had MML, which maybe a lot of the people listening here don't know what that is, but it's a compilable music language, so you can write your own music that would play on the PSG. So Devereaux is an interesting thing I'd like to do something with, but I don't know if it would be necessarily a MiSTer thing.
Yeah, I understand.
One thing that comes up from time to time and becomes a discussion, some people want it, some people don't want it, is the fact that turbo on joypads, the way that it's handled in MiSTer, it's based on a time-based generator in the system on a chip. It's not keyed off of how many scans of the joypad. And it would be an easy thing to do, but it's kind of inconsistent with the MiSTer design. So that's something I every once in a while toy with. Should I try it? Should I not try it? And another thing I was talking about today, these are all little tiny things, but I was talking with Gitrinks and Sorgalig about was the mouse. The PC Engine mouse has two buttons on its side. They are basically the run and the select button. The way that the core is currently implemented, you need to use your mouse and a pad, and that pad would be your run and select buttons, and the mouse would just be the buttons 1 and 2. That's not really how, like that. That's a little bit inconvenient for a PC Engine game player, because one of the things that you would do is maybe you would use a select button to switch back and forth between mouse and joypad, or on some games, or you really just want to press run to move, and you don't want to switch controllers. So right now, main MiSTer does not support the side buttons on the mouse, but it looks like we have a way forward on how that can take place. So as soon as that's built into the plumbing of the system, it's a one-liner to put it into the PC Engine core.
And to segue that, Trainix mentions that the Miracle works with the SNAC and the USB MIDI. And are there any adapters to connect PC Engine peripherals or controllers to SNAC?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, right? There is a SNAC adapter and a SNAC connector, but the way that the joypad polling takes place on the PC Engine is different than many of the other systems. So most systems they do serial, except for Saturn. The Sega systems. So like the Nintendo systems use a serial clocked input and I believe it's about 3 microseconds per cycle, or maybe it's 6 microseconds per cycle. It's somewhere in there. So it's a relatively slow clock signal. And for Sega and Atari type joysticks, it's a single scan or maybe a double scan where you scan it and then you flip a select bit, and then you read in the pulses after a brief pause. So on the PC Engine, that brief pause is very brief, and there's quite a bit of flip this, flip that, read, flip. So you end up having to get your signals transition in about a microsecond or less. And with SNAC the way that it is, that's too fast. So one of the things I was talking with Blue way back, who designed this the SNAC board that's out there, as I understand it, he said, "Oh, I tried it with a buffer, and it works." But I just kind of redesigned it. I said, "Here's some level shifts and buffer," and I made a smaller board, and I put that out there. And a couple of people asked me if they could sell it. I said, "Sure, go ahead. Not going to bother me at all. I think it'll make people happy to use it." So you would need that version of SNAC in order to use the mouse, in order to use the memory base 128, in order to use turbo or 6-button on some controllers, and even the multi-tap. So it's pretty sensitive.
I see. And regarding SNAC, Eric, do you have any thoughts on that?
I love SNAC. The idea of using original hardware. I want the MiSTer cores to be replacements for the original as much as possible. Like, there's no reason you'd ever want to use anything but it. So personally, I know there's the what you call it, the secondary SD card that's on there, and used by very much. If I were in charge, I'd be half tempted to try and co-opt some of those pins for a second SNAC port or something. But I understand the reasons for not doing that. But I love the idea of having things be as close to the original as a replacement as you can get it. So
all you need is an SD extender, and you can pull those pins out.
It's probably true. You would have to build your own cores to be able to use it, which is a little bit of an annoyance. But yeah.
And Behold asks, I lost track there for a second. So SNAC is too fast, basically, Dave? Like it creates signals that toggle too fast for MiSTer to register?
So to go into a little bit more detail, the core, it will flip a signal, the select pin, and then it will read the response from the joypad. And this all needs to happen within less than a microsecond. Normally that's not too fast if you're using regular logic chips and so on. But on SNAC, and I didn't say this the first time around, this is probably why there was some confusion. The SNAC port, because all of the wires can be mixed and matched and turn into inputs and turn into outputs, in order not to damage the board, they've all been defined as what we call open drain, which means it's either shorted to ground or it's floating. And when it's floating, it needs a pull-up resistor. So the pull-up resistor makes it high, but there is a rise time. And that rise time depends on how aggressive that resistor is. And if that resistor is too aggressive, then it actually pulls up the low signal above ground level and pulls it dangerously close to high itself. So the rise time on SNAC as it is makes it good to about 400 kilohertz, but it needs to be more like 1 to 2 megahertz in order to function. And you can do that with logic that knows which way the signals are going, which is what I implemented. The challenge though is that you have to be very specific about your device. You can't you can't just put a special snack board on and assume that it's going to work fine with any old adapter at the end.
Thank you. So, and regarding your own MiSTers, do you use them on LCDs? Do you use them on CRTs, Eric?
Currently, I've just got it hooked up to an LCD monitor close because I'm usually using it to debug. And the monitor is close and convenient. I like the option of having it work on CRT. I'd be sad if that ever went away.
Yeah, a lot of us would.
Not only just for like light gun games, but I do like CRTs. I know that's not a universally held position within the MiSTer dev community, but I do like the old CRTs. I've got a couple of them here that I like and use.
Dual output is awesome.
Yep.
Yeah, I love the CRT output as well. And of course, you can use the HDMI to PGA, well, HD15 DACs, right? And that's another part aside from the I/O board. And what about you, Dave?
Well, I only have one CRT in my house anymore. It's near the MiSTer. It's a Commodore 1701, and it's composite or theoretically SVGA, but I've never used it because it doesn't have a normal SVGA input. It's Chroma and Luma.
Yeah.
So I drive an HDMI monitor, but I use the composite monitor for real hardware. But I do have a couple of composite or composite adapters, but I've only got one of them to work. The one from Antonio Villena, I never got it to work. But there was another one, the MiSTer, that I got to work, but apparently the gentleman is, he has batches come in and they go out, and then there's a big pause or something going on. So I'm really hoping that that there are more of them out there. So I know that there are a bunch of people who are looking and are very interested in having them. I know that a couple of people are working on these as well.
Yeah, it's a very strange area because composite is a very complicated signal, right? And generating it from RGB is an interesting challenge, and we can do that way better than it could be done back in the day as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't have an RGB monitor, so I kind of always wanted one, but they've always been sort of out of my reach.
Yeah, they've become quite popular nowadays. And
well, in this community.
Yeah, of course.
Of course, they're unpopular with the people who made them available.
Yeah, there are no options to get one new from the shelf these days.
Yeah.
And after that, you moved to IRM62 arcade hardware. I'm skipping Neo Geo, but this one I find interesting because you grabbed another arcade PCB, Eric.
That one was actually just a small fix. I think it was Alan that was working on those, or somebody Alan was working with. I don't remember the specifics, but yeah, there was a color bug on there that that had been sitting there for a while, where everything was blue.
Oh.
And I think what that one turned out to be, there was a bug where after it had loaded all of the ROMs, it then loaded in dip switches, and it turns out that the dip switches were overwriting the color palettes a little bit.
Wow.
So all of the reds were being overwritten, and you would only get blues. So like a lot of those IRM62 games had color issues for a little while. So that was just something that I worked on relatively briefly. I guess the key point from that one is, if there's something that you think that I might work on and you want me to work on it, I can tell you a couple of things that would help. For one, document that it works, that is different than the way it works on real hardware, as thoroughly as you can. Set up something that makes it super easy to reproduce, as if I know nothing about the game, which I typically won't. And then, so steps to reproduce it as early in the game and as easily as possible. And if you do stuff like that, then there's a higher possibility that it's something that I might look at.
I think that's true
So-
for every bug on every core.
And also one more thing that also helps is decide that the thing that you want works on a good emulator.
Oh,
I know that sometimes that gets talked about how FPGA people hate emulators, and I can't say how wrong that is. I love emulators. Emulators are amazing tools for.
development and
And a lot of
research.
times they're good to play on, depending on the
Yeah.
type of game. They're fantastic, but for debugging, they're so much easier than debugging with the FPGA. And so having an emulator that you can compare to, that you can run things on and test things out on, is so much easier to find fixes for bugs. So
And it's so hard to find emulators with good debuggers, right? Where you can just open the RAM and everything.
yeah, I noticed that earlier when Dave was talking about his emulator that he was working on. His had a debugger, and that my ears perked up instantly. It's like, oh, I might have used that one then if it was if I was doing this at the time, because it had a debugger.
Yeah. It helps so much to just see everything plainly, right?
Yep.
When I was coding the Super Nintendo version of the suite, I usually work with real hardware, but sending the data to the flash card 10 years ago, some started to have USB ports. But it's easier or faster to cycle through software emulation for testing, right?
Absolutely, it is.
But it stopped me on my tracks when I started working on a faster cycle, working on an SNES emulator, and then I figured out that my code was no longer working on hardware.
Mm-hmm.
And man, thankfully, Higan came to the rescue. Well, BSNES at that time, but it was so much easier to debug when it works properly on a software emulator or wherever, because it's not limited to one area or the other. But you need to, when you're developing for one of these systems, it helps so much to have a real hardware reference, but it's hard. It's hard. And what about Neo Geo? We mentioned Fortec and his work on the PC Engine composite palette, but what can you tell us about your involvement with the Neo Geo core?
Yeah, so Fortec, I know Eeyore did the CPU, the 68K, and you had your Tego do the audio. The audio is kind of funny because it's written, I think, in a way that matches the hardware. Very specifically, it uses pipelining, and that's super confusing to read through, which means that nobody wants to look at it. It's hard to find bugs in it because the logic is confusing. You have to keep track of several things in your mind at the same time, and it's that way. I'm pretty sure because that's the way the actual hardware works, and that makes it easier to make it more accurate. But it's super confusing to look through, and so I know when they were first when Vertex Core first was coming out, there were a lot of audio bugs, and nobody wanted to look at it at all. So that's kind of the other thing that sometimes might motivate me to get to look at something is if it's been sitting there for a while and nobody else wants to, maybe I'll take a look. If it's not too hard, I'll try it. And so, because I had done that back when, there's been a couple of bugs that have been sitting there for a long time, and periodically, I think recently somebody gave some updated documentation on one of the bugs. There was this audio warble that was happening on it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had looked through the code before on the audio, I kind of had a rough idea of what might be the problem. And so if you think about how they would describe this problem, they'd say that the audio sounds drunk, or that it sounds like it's kind of inconsistently moving in pitch. And to me, that just based on that description, what I'm going to be looking for to fix the bug is something where you have an inconsistent delay. And having looked through most of the code in the actual sound generation chip that's there's not too much wrong that can happen with inconsistent delays. It'll generally, if there's a bug there, it's usually going to be something like the audio will run slow consistently, or it'll run fast consistently, or it'll be a certain pitch wrong all the time. You don't expect it to be something where it varies. And so my first thought was I knew that there was some code in there for handling the way that the way that we're retrieving samples, because of how much throughput the Neo Geo core has as far as memory. I mean, it accesses huge amounts of memory all the time. that required us to put the audio stuff in the DDR.
Wow.
And DDR can have variable response times. And so the first thing that I'm looking at is I know there's a delay there. Is that the problem? That's the first thing I'm going to go check. And so I started trying to write out this thing where I could cache the sample where it sounded especially bad to me, where I could actually hear it. That was, again, one of the things where somebody had produced a sample that I could hear very clearly was wrong. So I said, oh, okay, I'll take a look. And so I was thinking, oh, I'll go cache this. And then I mentioned to Katrinks that I thought this might be it. And she said, she just went ahead and built a version where you just ignored the delay on the DDR and just played whatever was there no matter what. And it sounds normal. So it's like, okay, yeah, that's the problem. And then so what I tried to do after that was then I noticed that the delay, it was constantly delaying the chip as soon as a next sample was requested, whether or not it needed the results of that sample right away. So I went in there and dug through the pipelining code to say, okay, you request it here. It doesn't actually need the sample back so where it can store it in the pipeline for a few cycles later, so you don't have to delay it right away. And so I went and added in some extra code so that it doesn't delay it right away. It waits until it actually needs it. If you do that, the warble goes away. So after somebody went through and actually made some very specific examples that I could reproduce, it took a day to fix. And this has been sitting there for a couple of years, a year and a half, broken.
And it's interesting because the issue was not the implementation; it was the MiSTer specific architecture, right? And not even the Neo Geo itself.
No, nothing wrong with the actual code. It's the basis of the problem is that there's a limitation of the RAM access when using the DDR, specific to using it on MiSTer, and you can overcome that if you look really closely at when you actually need to get the data and adjust delays so that it can get there in time.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a things like that with the memory are kind of the biggest what's the word? Limitation. The biggest limitation of MiSTer. I know that for example, the GBA core has a couple of operations that it can't complete in time based on the memory. But the solution there that FPGA Spasms put in was that he counts how long it's late and then he makes it up for it almost immediately afterwards. So it never gets more than just a teeny bit out of phase. And the actual implementation of there is perfectly correct if you ever move to hardware that has more memory. So the actual preserved core is perfect. It's just there's a slight deviation there to make it work on MiSTer. And in this particular case for the Neo Geo, it's not even. It doesn't even have to go out of sync. It just needed a little more care to make sure that it would fit, and then it doesn't need to do stuff like that. But I think that the reason that we have save states might have something to do with the fact that he added in this thing where you could adjust it, save it a little bit. You're waiting for the signal to come, and then you could jump it, and then it could speed up for a little bit. I think that might have kicked off the reason why that core has save states a little bit. I could be wrong, but.
Could be. Well, I think you got lucky with that bug fix, though. Honestly.
Yeah. That one was lucky. It's interesting because the other thing that I've been working on now is there's also another bug that I think is the oldest one in the GitHub issues list for it. Is there's this broken DS and Breaker's Revenge where it's missing a couple of sprites, and so both this audio thing and this versus bug I started looking at mainly in preparation for this because I wanted something I could talk about. So don't think that you can always, if you've got bugs that you want, you can't just invite me onto a program to get me to fix more things. But it worked this time. But anyway, this versus bug, I have narrowed it down. I'm pretty sure that the issue is related to the way that it's handling the last two sprites that it can process on a scan line. If you look at signal tap and you draw out all the signals of what it's doing at the end of the scan line, you'll see that the last two, the sprites that are missing, are actually being read, and they have the correct data in them, but the code that pushes them onto the line buffer that it uses has already switched to the next line. And so the reason it's not working is because either the reading from the 95th and 96th sprite is happening too late, or the code to push onto the line buffer is switching over too soon. And so now I'm in one of these situations, just like we've talked about before, where I don't know what the real hardware does. So I've got code that fixes it, but I don't know that I'm fixing it the right way. And so I'm hesitant to touch this code that I know has been worked out from decapped chips, and I'm going to mess it up if I try and fix it the wrong way. And I'm scared to do it. So,
and I know why people do that. I know that you know the best of intentions. I always wish that when emulators authors make those choices, that they would document it. I'm not sure that this is the way that it should be, but I'm going to do it this way anyway.
Yeah. In this case, I even have this, like, Furtek has shown me where the schematics are. I can't find it. I know it's got to be there somewhere because I can tell that the signals are how they should be, but I can't find it. I don't know what to do with it. So maybe I could probably post a work in progress in the test channel if anybody wanted to try it, but I'm disappointed in this one. So I got lucky with the audio one, and this one I spent a couple of weeks since and still haven't been able to figure it correctly.
If you had a console and a logic state analyzer, would it be possible to determine which of those two behaviors is correct?
I think it absolutely would be, and even then it would probably help to, if you did that, you could probably then go look at the schematics from the decap and say, it's got to be right here, and then somebody who looked at that would maybe see it where I'm missing it. But yeah, a capture would point you to the correct place in the schematics easier.
Well, I got to say, it's so much better now than it used to be for the price of test equipment.
Yeah, it certainly is. Because we can go, I'm usually trying to help. I know that I owe one such measurement to Ace. I know it, I will do it, sorry. But that's the kind of work that we, if possible, need to do because test equipment is more accessible than ever.
Yeah, I got myself a 32-line logic analyzer recently. I'm going to make some use of it. I'm going to see if I can figure out whether the PCFX is what I think it is.
Awesome.
Or what we think it is in emulation, at least.
Let me know if I can help.
You know, it occurs to me that the DE10 Nano with some level shifters would make it an outstanding logic analyzer.
It would be impressive to have a core for that, because so many people could help. I know that there's the other side of the user or contributor having the original hardware, but it would make such a good bridge.
It's funny you should say that. I actually gave some thought to, it's not exactly the same, but I was going to set up something with level shifters on the back of the PC Engine and feed it into a DE10 Nano so I could do some timing in exactly that same way. It's really cool because you got a big amount of DDR3 memory in there to hold your traces. You could even, at a starter point, you could send them to Signal Tap if you wanted. Yep. All sorts of cool bits.
Yeah, it's so much better. And Katrinic says that SRG 320 uses the DE10 Nano to do all his logic captures of real hardware. Awesome. And RetroPress asked us if regarding that miracle piano bug, if it's only in the NES game or if there's a chance that it also affects the Super Nintendo version.
I'm actually not sure. I know that the song list isn't identical between the NES, the Super Nintendo, the Genesis, the Amiga, or the PC. I think they're all slightly different song lists. I don't know if the same songs are there, and even if it's there, I don't know if it happens in the same way. I could certainly find out. And actually, the code that's there for the NES could very easily be moved to the
Super Nintendo.
Super Nintendo and the Genesis, if anybody felt like trying it, it's the Super Nintendo in particular is almost the exact same. You just have to change a couple of constants for different clock rates, and it should just start working. But I haven't actually tried the Super Nintendo to know if it's the same or not with that bug.
So you can usually so you can literally make DLC packs for the other games.
Yeah, you could. I assume that they're in the same format between them, but I haven't checked that.
Yeah, most probably.
And I have, like I said, I kind of got addicted to the Miracle Piano, so I bought one, and it came with a whole bunch of add-on songs for the PC. I should probably look to get those dumped somehow. They're on old floppies that are probably dying.
Do you have hardware to read those?
I'm not sure. I did at one point, but I'm not sure that those floppy drives still work or not. They're pretty old, and I haven't turned them on in a long time.
They probably do. I don't know. I know people think that they are fragile, but in my experience, they are so resilient. And if you don't have a way to use those floppy drives, you can use a pull-in that attaches to the D10 Nano, and you can do flux dumps with them. It's still not ready for general consumption, I believe, but it's getting there fast.
Really looking forward to that.
I am. Yes, I am. Usually I use the other solutions that are in the market, and they are pretty good. And I hope pull-in can surpass them. I hope.
Yes, it's. I know I've been hearing about that from Joseph Redon of the Video Game Preservation.
Yeah, and, from Japan.
Yeah, and it really looks promising. I would like more information.
Yeah, I probably will get one. We're getting off topic, but I'll probably get one since I work a lot on X68000 dumps. And regarding game habits, I already asked you a bit about playing on current platforms, but do you guys play on current platforms? What are your thoughts on the current state of the industry, Eric?
Well, I did. Did we already mention this? That I used to work on Nintendo until a little bit. I don't know if that's the transition layer that sits between, or that you can play GameCube games on the Wii and the Wii U.
Mm-hmm.
I worked on that for a little while, and so it's kind of roughly where I stopped playing most recent consoles. I have a Wii U, but I don't have anything more recent than that. So the most recent game that I've played is probably Breath of the Wild, Zelda again.
Oh, it's a great game.
Yep.
And
I don't have anything against newer games, especially like and obviously the retro style indie games. I tend to like those as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I tend to gravitate more towards the older ones than the newer ones.
And it's great that we are getting so much homebrew. And what about you, Dave?
Well, I'm basically a 2D guy, so I kind of ignored the PlayStation, the Sega Saturn in their lifetime, but I've become interested in the Saturn since then. I did have a GameCube, and that's kind of grown on me, but I don't play it a lot. A couple of handheld systems, Game Boy Advance, NDS, but PCs, not really. Just the only things I think I've ever played on a PC since then have been Super Meat Boy, the Cave Story, and Falcom stuff.
Falcom stuff, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, 2D is really where I am. The 90s was magical, I think. We had at the same time video games evolving and J-pop turning from something crappy with idol singers into actual music, and pretty good stuff too. And we had anime happening all at the same time, and toward the second half of the decade, you saw all three influences, on each other, at least in Japanese gaming. And that's what touches me. The American stuff, not so much, although Doom and Quake and stuff like that were very interesting. I I don't think I really have such a connection with FPS or anything like that.
Yeah, I follow you in that last part completely. It's simply I'm not good at them, and I'm not into them.
Yeah, I thought they were really cool at the beginning, and then when it just kept going, I thought, well, this is actually getting not so interesting to me.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, anybody could tell us that 2D is the same way, right? But we are simply into 2D, and you'd rather get Cleopatra's Curse.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it.
And regarding physical and original media, what are your thoughts on that? Did you still get your homebrew or old games in physical format? How do you feel about that?
Me? I mean, you may or may not know this. I think you know this about me, but the audience probably may not. For the PC Engine, I collected pretty much every game that was ever produced and is still produced. So original media. I don't care to play it on the original media, but to have the original as a, you know, you've got the manual and you've got the artwork and especially with the Japanese games, there were lots of pack-ins and maps and hint books and things like that. But you know, just as an artifact, and as a definitive source.
That's exactly what I thought. I was going to add that because it's the definitive reference while you keep it working. And you can keep stuff working. It's just like Theseus paradox. You can just replace parts and keep it working. But if you're careful about it, it's a reference for the future, for having a proper way of how it should work from now onwards, right?
That's right. And I say a definitive source, not the definitive source, because there were many different repressings of some of these games. Not all of them were ever repressed, but for example, Tokimeki Memorial went through at least 7 iterations because of all the different bugs and things that were fixed. And I knew that there were several versions, and I have a couple of them, but I don't have all of them, and I've completely lost interest in obtaining them.
Do you know of any HuCard games that have revisions?
That's a good question. Not really. I do know a couple that were prone to decay. Bonk's Adventure 2 and its Japanese counterpart. Those are probably the worst offenders.
Yeah.
There was one, I think the original game, the Kung Fu, was originally pressed wrong or burned wrong, and it didn't actually run. So the story I read recently was that they drilled a hole in the card to mark that it was either non-functional or it had some big bug, and they had to repress the entire run.
Wow. And what about you, Eric? Do you have any thoughts on this subject?
Number one, I blame TMR a little bit. I went a little nuts after watching him beating all those games, so I started collecting a little bit back then. So I've probably got about half of maybe a little more than half of the North American NES library on cart.
What year was this?
None of the sorry.
What year was this?
Oh, when was TMR doing this? It took him 3 years or something to go through all of them, and
so it's like 8 years or 9 years ago. I don't know.
Oh, it was in
I don't
this
think it was
century?
quite that long ago. It's fairly recent that he did this, and he did it on a mixture of emulators and
hardware.
On hardware and.
Oh, that's got to be expensive.
He now probably has pretty close to a complete collection at this point, but at the time he was using whatever he could. But
I'll tell you, if I was started in that year, I would not be anywhere close to that on PC Engine, and I would have given up.
Yeah, it was easier.
I took a trip, my first trip ever to Japan in 1997, and I met up with some friends, and they were saying, "Oh, look at this! It's on discount here. You'd have games in the 100 yen box." You know, my average game cost was like 700 yen at that time. I came home with like 250 of them.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So I've got a hard limit on how much I spent even throughout that time where I was collecting them a little bit. So I don't have any of the super expensive ones. But I've got more than I used to, or more than I intend to. And at this point, I probably wouldn't mind getting rid of them. I don't think I need them, and especially for ones where you can get the game legally
in a collection,
where you can buy the ROM. Then I don't have any qualms about needing to keep the original one.
And as long as the mapper is well known, right?
That's right. That's right. It is kind of nice that I can go compare with the real one if I need to for some of them, but I don't have any truly expensive ones. It's funny. My most expensive game is actually a box. not for the NES. I rarely throw away boxes, and so I've got a semi-rare box that I have no intention of keeping, but haven't sold yet.
Yeah, we'll stand on different areas in this, but it's kind of part of the mystique around this. We are in the 3-hour mark. I'm loving having you here, but I know that you might have other stuff to do.
I don't have a problem if there's still stuff to talk about.
And what about you, Eric?
Yeah, well, I can stay for a little longer if we've got something to talk about.
No, would you want to bring any other topic to the table?
I don't know. What about you, Dave?
Well, I mean, the only thing that that comes to mind is not exactly MiSTer related, but I've been doing a bunch of stuff on with electronics lately.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of bridging the gap and getting into the world with where I can probe the original machines, and that's really interesting. I don't know if that's something that, that you guys are doing. Oh, here we got another question.
Yeah.
What upcoming things in MiSTer are you looking forward to? Well, obviously, I'm looking forward to the Saturn core, if and when. I mean, I don't know that it's possible yet, but it is looking very good.
Mm-hmm.
One day, I'd like to be able to put together like an arcade core, but that's more of a time commitment than I can really invest at the moment. Something like Targ, Spectar, that kind of a thing. Those old Exidy games. Probably a lot of people in the audience don't know what I'm talking about.
Probably, but they can look it up.
Yeah, 1980-ish. That was sort of the magical era when Space Invaders, being mostly black and white, became something with a limited number of colors, but they came up with all sorts of really interesting other patterns.
Yeah, I recall how early games started using synths, and that's an interesting area.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, it was also difficult because they used a lot of analog circuitry.
Yeah, timers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just resistors and capacitors to change the pitch, right?
Yeah, and the AY38910.
Yeah, love that one. The basis for everything after that.
Yeah. How about you, Eric? What you looking forward to?
Likewise, the Saturn, I don't have any experience with the Saturn really at all, so it'll be interesting to play around with it a little bit.
Oh.
As far as things that I might want to work on, I don't know. I try not to talk about what I want to work on, because then
you commit
create expectations, and then it's no longer fun if people expect it. So, I mean, like for example, the speech synthesizer for the TI-99, I was working on that for a good year, off and on, and I would have felt annoyed if I felt pressured to get it done at any time. So.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you touch on, because once you announce you're working on something, it becomes work instead of a hobby.
Yep.
Yeah, I know there's people that can do that, but it's hard for me. Sorry, Dave.
Well, I think it's more a question of when people start asking about it, right? I mean, if you say it and nobody asks about it and then you're done, I mean, you've done it in your own pace. But if people start asking about it, then it's a subtle pressure, and probably neither side is conscious of it, but it's there.
Yeah, and also it could be demoralizing, right? If you announce it and nobody cares. I mean, it's for you mainly.
Yeah, it doesn't get to me, but like I say, I do this for me.
Yeah, which is the good part, right? And when you believe that what you're doing, besides your own intentions, or it can help somebody else out there, even if they don't know it.
Oh yeah, for sure. I'm actually really surprised at how many people, give me likes on my tweets. Right, I just pop it out there to let people know. But hey, people do seem interested. So hey,
That's good. And Trinix asks, Dave, how do you feel about the PCFX? It has a reputation as kind of a niche interest, but are there things about it you find underappreciated?
yeah, it's a lot of complex feelings about the PCFX. I have a couple of them here and an FXGA, and I always intended to play them. And the truth is, I probably over the course of 20 years, I probably turned it on for about an hour. But I've always intended to. It's a very Japanese system, and the thing is that with the evolution of games on CD in that era, they went heavy on the text, and Japanese is an opaque language, and I started learning it because of the PC Engine a little over 10 years ago, and it's still hard.
Mm-hmm.
But I can get through a number of games, but not all games. And especially PCFX is aimed at an older audience, so they would be more opaque. I think it's difficult, difficult system.
Do you have many games for the PCFX?
I have the whole set. There's not that many for them.
Wow, I have 6. Yeah, because
but again,
yeah.
I mean, my interest on the PCFX, I think, is like I want to translate some games on that. Right? I did a couple of PC Engine games, but really trivial ones. I think 1 or maybe 2 games have been translated on PCFX.
Yeah, do Firewoman Motoigumi, please.
Well, I was thinking Zenki might be a little easier.
Oh, yeah, of course. And I don't have that one. So it becomes so expensive in the last decade.
Yeah, it's so crazy walking around Akihabara and looking in the glass case and seeing it's like $700.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy.
But yeah, I mean, they're...
Team Innocent. Come on, that one.
Yeah, maybe. Like I see the PCFX as being a viable competitor to about 5% of the Saturn's collection.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's why I think Saturn is more interesting than PCFX. But PCFX is interesting because it's the undiscovered country.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to do a version of the 240p test suite for PSFX when I what one, because I found that SDK by Trap15.
Oh. Well, I got to get this FXGA out to you somehow. So you'll get the dev kit. At least you might need a PC98 to go with it. But
I do have a PC98 laptop. But that's it. So no good.
No desktop, eh?
No desktop. We'll see.
I thought if anybody had one, it would be you.
I know. I'm in love with the PC88, but I it's so hard to get a PC98 without going to Japan and the pandemic and everything and money and costs. Impossible.
Yeah.
You ever gotten into something like that? Obscure Japanese platforms, Eric?
Obscure Japanese platforms? Don't think so. No. My path was mainly you start on that TV scoreboard Pong thingy that we had, and went to TI-99, NES. I think we had a Commodore 128 after that.
Mm-hmm.
And then regular PC, and I think I had a Game Boy Advance at some point. So I didn't never have a Super Nintendo or a Genesis growing up, or a TurboGrafx PC Engine. So those were kind of what I grew up, and PlayStation. We got a PlayStation, so that was kind of my path. And not a lot of those had Japanese games that I can recall. Most of it was just the stuff that was, well, for the NES, it was stuff that was at the local thing that you could rent for free for $1.50 for a weekend. Those were a super cheap rental place.
That's great because you have a lot of stuff to explore.
Yeah.
Well, if you someday feel such inclined, and Trinix asks if you got any cores that you'd like to make from scratch.
From scratch, I worry that I'm too lazy for that.
Yeah,
it takes a long time to write one of those from scratch, so it's a pretty significant time commitment. I think I'm better suited to looking for bugs that I can identify and maybe fix. Or
I fully understand you.
I had actually considered doing the Intellivision until I saw Grabulasari had his Doherty had started one, and so I had considered doing that one just because it looked like it was small and needed. It seemed like we needed that one in MiSTer, so I'm glad that one did show up. So I didn't have to do it.
Trinix says that the world could use more Megaduck. And
I've still never seen a Megaduck game run. I admit that. I don't know proudly or humbly or what, but I admit it. I don't think I've seen a Megaduck game run.
Yeah, but I understand you. I follow you. I kind of feel the same way, that I have something that I do that gets some stuff documented, and it's hard to move away from that path because you see that there are not much people doing that same kind of thing, and you're feeling a small void, right?
Yeah. Somebody's got to fix the bugs.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's one of the things people like that write the cores. Some of them like work on them forever, but others of them, I think, put it out there and kind of hope that somebody will make them better. I kind of hope that that some of the original authors are kind of glad that people are still working on them. I hope that's true.
And I can see that why that's fun for them, right? Because it's creating something and polishing it for somebody else, different profiles. Sexter asks, if you could meet the engineers of the original hardware, what would you ask them?
Can I have the schematics?
That's about it.
Oh yeah, and maybe I would ask them about intentions, because there's so much thing that, okay, we have the original hardware as a reference, but you don't know if stuff has decayed. You don't know if the proper palette was a composite one. You don't know. You can measure it and you can tell that was the result, but the intention, because with MiSTer you can enhance things, right? Like have more sprites per line on the NES core or the PC Engine or the Genesis or whatever. But intentions would be nice because was this intended to be seen on a composite display, RGB? We know that they jumped between those, and also about pixel aspect ratios and circles and how they are supposed to look. We have the approximations to the proper ones, but still, knowing from the original designers what was the intention would be cool.
Yeah, it's. I think it wouldn't be the form of a question. It would be more like a big long conversation.
Yeah. What color is the sky? Says Sentient 6.
Are there two bands of blue, or are there three?
Yeah. What was the intention again?
Yeah.
So, Well, I've been having a great time, guys. I don't know about you. Any more topics that the audience wants to ask, or anything that you want to mention? Social networks or projects, or where can they follow you and support you in such scenarios, if you consider those?
Well, I'm on Twitter. That's about it. I don't do any of the Facebook stuff or anything like that. What is my handle again? I've forgotten.
David underscore.
Yes, it's dshadoff_D.
Yeah, that's right. I always get mixed up and let autocomplete do the work.
Yeah, and and I think something to watch out for over the next little while is Raspberry Pi has come out with a microcontroller called the RP2040.
Oh yeah.
And this thing is kind of the best of FPGA and the best of computing at the same time. You can have these little PIO, programmable I/O state machines that can oscillate at like 130 megahertz, and you can write a program that executes every cycle an instruction that can actually output something on the PIOs, the IO lines every cycle. So they've actually written emulators that modulate the VGA all on the same chip. So it's like, yeah, you just have a resistor network on the output, and it's all one chip, and that chip is about $1.
Wow.
So this is maybe not the future, but it is a future. I see in the immediate future, this is going to have a lot of use in I/O devices, controllers, things like that, adjunct as opposed to core of a machine. But it shouldn't be too long before this stuff really starts gaining traction.
Nice. RSN8887 asks if the clock speed ever been a limiting factor on MiSTer.
I think you get close to it on like the AO486. That one's kind of a special case just because it's kind of a moving target. You always want to see if you can maybe do a little more performance that you can squeeze out of it, because because 486 isn't really a definitive hard target, and there's different things that you could aim for there. I don't know that that's exactly clock speed so much as it is just running out of resources to hold everything at the same time, but they're semi-related. Mm-hmm. If the clock speed was a little higher, you could probably push a few more things closer to the limit of what of how many resources you have on the chip. But I don't think for the current stuff that it's a limit too much.
Okay.
The clock speed is related to the timing, and the timing is related to the program structure and the amount of resources in use and a bunch of other things. So timing closure is a big subject that I wish I knew more about.
Yeah, getting the thing to actually close is hard, but I don't think it's a limit of the D10 Nano for any of the cores that exist.
I see. And where can they reach you, Eric, if they are interested?
I hang out in the MiSTer Discord. At me, I'll usually notice it. That's about it.
Oh, great. Well, any closing comments? It's been a pleasure talking with you. It's been super entertaining, and I bet that we could, if we throw stuff at the table, we can keep on talking. But I think we have to close this episode. And any closing comments or stuff that you want to talk about?
Well, for me, I'm thinking just play games, enjoy, and don't send me too many bug reports. But when you do, if you find a bug, please give me as much information as can possibly exist, and like a save game if you got one.
Eric?
I would say those exact words. If you've got bugs, make them as thorough as you can, with much information. Tell us how to reproduce it as easily as you can, and you're more likely to get somebody to look at it that way.
Excellent. Well,
actually, there was one more thing. There was somebody was talking, and I've heard there's a whole area of research on this. A bunch of people, speedrunners like to to try and create these devices to capture their
Input.
joypad.
Yeah.
Yeah, their inputs so that they can be replayed. And I think there's some merit to that. There was a little discussion that started on the forum, so it might be something that we might want to look into at some point.
Sounds
Are you
interesting.
talking about like tool-assisted speedruns?
Yeah, but I mean, if somebody was able to give you a
The
test,
input.
yeah, the inputs here, just run these inputs through your virtual controller, and you will see the bug, right?
That's pretty much kind of what the tool-assisted speedruns files are like,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, they kind of already work on the NES core.
Nice.
Just Drinks did that a while back.
Cool.
That doesn't exist for all of them.
Yeah.
It sure doesn't exist for the PC Engine. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
There you have it. So, well, thank you all for listening, and thank you too for the time and for being such great guests and having so many topics, and of course for all the work you do for the community and for MiSTer. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having us. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you so much. It has been fun. Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.